Eumeswil by Ernst Jünger, 1977. Translated by Joachim Neugroschel. Narrated by an artificial intelligence based on the voice of Tony J. Produced by Parker Banks at pbanks.net and youtube.com/pbanks. The Teachers. 1. My name is Manuel Venator. I am the night steward in the Casbah of Eumeswil. My appearance is unobtrusive. In athletic contests I can expect third prize, and I have no problems regarding women. Soon I will be 30. My character is regarded as pleasant, which is already inherent in my profession. Politically, I am considered reliable, if not especially committed. So much for a brief personal description. My information is sincere, although still vague. I will gradually make it more precise. As such, it contains the outline of an overall account. To make the vague more precise, to define the indefinite more and more sharply, that is the task of every development, every temporal exertion. That is why physiognomies and characters become more distinct as the years go by. The same applies to handwriting. The sculptor at first confronts the raw block, the pure material, which encompasses any and all possibilities. It responds to the chisel. The latter can destroy or it can release water of life, spiritual power from the material. All this is indefinite even for the master. It does not hinge entirely on his will. Vagueness, imprecision, even in invention, are not the falsehoods. They may be incorrect, but they must not be insincere. A statement, imprecise but not untrue, can be interpreted sentence by sentence until the thing finally rebalances and swings back into the center. But if an utterance begins with a lie, so that it has to be propped up by more and more lies, then eventually the structure collapses. Hence my suspicion that creation itself began with a fraud. Had it been a simple mistake, then paradise could be restored through evolution. But the old man concealed the tree of life. This touches upon my sorrow, irrevocable imperfection, not only in creation, but also in my own person. It causes hostility toward the gods on the one side and self-criticism on the other. Perhaps I tend to overdo these things. In any case, they both weaken my actions. But not to worry. I am not trying to pen a treatise on moral theology. 2. Right off I must specify that while my last name is indeed Venator, my first name is actually Martin and not Manuel. Martin is, as the Christians phrase it, my Christian name. In our country, the latter is given by the father. He calls the newborn baby by his name while picking him up and letting him prove his existence by bawling his lungs out. Manuel, in contrast, has become my nickname during my employment here in the Casbah. It was bestowed on me by the Condor. The Condor, being the current ruler of Eumeswil, is my employer. For years now, he has been residing in the Casbah, the citadel, which some 2 leagues beyond the city crowns a bare hill that has been known as Pagos since time out of mind. This relationship between city and fortress can be found in many places. It is the most convenient tie not just for tyranny, but for any one-man regime. The tribunes, toppled by the Condor, had resided inconspicuously in the town, ruling from the municipio. If there is only one arm, it has a more powerful effect on the long lever. If many people have a say, they need fermentation. They infiltrate whatever exists, like yeast in bread. Those words were spoken by Vigo, my teacher. I will come back to him later. Now just why did the Condor want Arid thus order me to be nicknamed Manuel? Did he prefer the Iberian flavor, or did he have something against Martin? That was my initial conjecture, and indeed, there is a dislike of certain first names, or at least an irritability that we do not sufficiently take into account. Some parents encumber a child for life with a name that expresses their wishful thinking. A gnome walks in and introduces himself as Caesar. Other parents choose the name of whoever happens to be at the helm, just as there are now little condors here among rich and poor. This too can be harmful, especially in periods without a sure succession to the throne. People, and this is true for the majority, pay scant notice to the harmony between the given name and the last. Schach von Wuthenau, that is strenuous. It is almost a phonetic imposition. In contrast, Emilia Galotti, Eugénie Grandet, this combination floats light and well-balanced through acoustic space. Naturally, the German form, Eugenie, should have a Gallic and not a Germanic stress, Eugenie with a weakened O. Similarly, the people here have ground down the name Eumenes. It dwells in Eumeswil. We are now getting to the crux of the matter, the condor's extreme musical sensibility which is offended by Martin. His reaction is understandable, for the middle consonants sound hard and jagged, they grate on the ear. Mars is the patron saint. Such delicacy is, to be sure, bizarre in a ruler who owes his power to weapons. This contradiction dawned on me only after some long observation, even though it casts its shadow on everyone. Each person you see has his day side and his night side, and some people become different at twilight. In the condor, this distinction is unusually salient. His appearance remains the same, a middle-aged bachelor with the slightly stooped shoulders of a horseman, plus a smile that has charmed many people-friendly joviality. However, the sensorium changes. The diurnal raptor, the grasper who peers into the distance following remote movements, becomes nocturnal. His eyes recover in the shadows, his hearing grows finer. It is as if a veil had dropped away from the face, opening up new sources of perception. The condor sets great store by visual acuteness. Seldom does a candidate who wears glasses stand a chance with him. This is particularly true for command positions in the Army and the Coast Guard. The applicant is invited for a chat, during which the condor sounds him out. His study, towering above the flat roof of the Kasbah, is a round, swiveling glass dome. During the interview, the condor usually convinces himself of the aspirant's visual strength by pointing to a ship or a very distant sail and questioning him about its type and direction. Of course, all this is preceded by rigorous examinations. They are to be confirmed by the condor's personal assessment. With the transformation from diurnal to nocturnal raptor, the taste shifts from dogs to cats, both of which are raised in the Kasbah. For reasons of security, the space between the fortress and the ring-shaped bailey is kept bat and unplanted. In other words, it is meant to be a field of fire. Brawny mastiffs slumber there in the shade of the bastions or frolic on the flat terrain. Since the animals can easily become a nuisance, a bridge leads from the square where the cars halt to the entrance of the Kasbah. Should I have any business on the terrain, I never set foot there without one of the guards. I'm astounded by their nonchalant way of taking hold of the animals. I am already repulsed if they nuzzle me or their tongues slurp my hand. In many respects, the animals are smarter than we. They obviously whiff my malaise, and it could intensify into fear, at which point they would leap upon me. One never knows when they might get serious. This is a trait they share with the condor. The mastiffs, dark Tibetans with yellow noses and yellow eyebrows, are also used for hunting. They go wild with joy when they hear the horn at dawn. They can be sicked on the most robust adversaries. They attack the lion and the rhinoceros. This pack is not the only one. Remote from the Kasbah but observable from the heights, a complex of stables, coach houses, aviaries, and open and covered riding courses stretches along the beach. It also includes the kennels for the greyhounds. The condor loves galloping along the very edge of the sea with his minions. The party is surrounded by the swarm of steppe dogs. They are used for hunting gazelles. Their style of running evokes the racers and ball balancers who triumph in the arena here. Intelligence and character have fallen victim to speed. Their skulls are narrow with truncated foreheads. Their muscles ripple nervously under the skin. In a long chase they run their quarry down, indefatigable, as if a spring were uncoiling inside them. Often the gazelle could escape if it were not brought to bay by the hawk. The sparrowhawk is unhooded and tossed aloft. The hounds, and behind them, the mounted sportsmen follow its flight, which guides them to the game. This hunt across vast areas covered only with half a grass offers a grand spectacle. The world becomes simpler while the tension grows. This is one of the best gifts that the condor offers his guests. He himself enjoys it festively, and a verse from the edge of the desert seems tailored to him. A good hawk, a swift hound, a noble steed are worth far more than 20 women indeed. Needless to say, falconry, with all the ins and outs of bagging, bearing, and taming, is held in high esteem. Peregrines and sakers are caught in clapnets throughout the land. Others, including snow-white creatures, come from the far north. Every year the yellow khan, his most stellar hunting guest, brings them as presents for the condor. Falconry is practiced through ample areas on the banks of the Sus. The riverside location is favorable for the training. Countless waterbirds nest in the lowland forests. They gather to fish on the inundated sandbanks. The heron is the most suitable bird for training hawks to hunt wildfowl. Other breeds of dogs are also necessary, long-eared spaniels which like going into water. Their fur has white spots allowing the marksman to recognize them in the reeds. The chief falconer is Rosner, who obtained a degree in zoology and then, out of passion, turned to hunting. And he did the right thing, for while any number of professors can be found in Eumeswil, such an extraordinary falconer is a windfall. But he is also a professor. I frequently see him in the Kasbah and at his institute, and occasionally run into him during solitary strolls in the hunting area. Once, during the migration of the peregrines, I accompanied him to one of his blinds. There, where the steppe borders on a towering clump of broom bushes, the fowler hid in their shade. A dove on a long string served as decoy. Whenever a hawk approached, Rosner jerked the string, making the dove fly up. Once it was grabbed and held by the predator, the two birds could be pulled effortlessly to a ring through which the thread ran and where the clapnet dropped. The process was thrilling as a model of intelligent snaring. There were circumstances that exceeded the boundaries of human sight and seemed almost magical. Thus, the dove must soar up at the passing of a hawk that eludes even the sharpest human eye. For this purpose, the falconer uses as his lookout a dappled, thrush-sized bird, which he ties up near the dove. Not quite recognizing the sparrowhawk at an incredible distance, the bird more likely senses it. Then it warns with a shattering shriek. This hunt has a magical impact, for it seems to feather the world. In the bewitchment, the hunters become one with their prey. They alight in their wiles. It was not just the dark trapper who had dedicated his life to this activity. The scholarly ornithologist likewise turned into a papageno and took part as a somnambular dancer. I myself was overcome with the deep and rapid breathing of passion. It should, however, be noted that I am no hunter. Indeed, despite my last name, I find hunting repulsive. Perhaps all of us are born to be fishers and fowlers, and killing is our mission. Fine, then I have transformed this desire. During a heron hunt, I feel for the victim rather than for the hawk that kills it. Over and over the heron keeps trying to gain altitude, and over it keeps getting outsoared, until at last its plumage flies. The gazelle is one of the tenderest of creatures. Pregnant women like to keep them at hand. Their eyes are celebrated by the poets. I saw the eyes of the gazelle break at the end of the chase, while the hawk fluttered in the dust and the hounds panted. Hunters delight especially in killing beauty. However, we are talking about the condor and his day vision, and not the eyes of the gazelle. Still, I will have to deal with hunting again, and in various dimensions at that, but qua observer and not qua hunter. Hunting is a regale, a prerogative of rulers. It captures the essence of rulership, not just symbolically but also ritually, through the spilled blood on which the sun shines. My job involves taking a greater part in the condor's night side. One then sees bespectacled pale-faces, often as if they were gathering in an owl's nest, professors, literati, masters of unprofitable arts, sheer hedonists who contribute to comfort and coziness. Acumen has now shifted to the ear. Illusions lie not in the words but in the sounds alone, or even in the mimicry. At such moments I have to prick up my ears. Other topics, chiefly artistic ones, are debated, and the hunt, it seems, only in a strangely enciphered manner. This must be observed. The room is quite noise-proof. It is my job to attune the sounds. At such times the condor finds loud and harsh speech repulsive, even painful. That is why he has given nicknames to some of the regular convives and officials, making sure that these new cognomens form an overall euphony. Attila, say, his physician, who barely leaves his side, is called Aldi. Should the Condor wish to have me perform some service for Attila, he says, Emanuelo Aldi. That sounds smooth. When I, like anyone having business in his proximity, was introduced to the Condor, he picked out his name for me. Manuel, Manuelo, Emanuelo, depending on the phonetic context. His way of distinguishing and modulating deepens the effect when he addresses people. In the Agora, the how is even more important than the what, the delivery more powerful than the facts that it can alter, indeed create. Currying favor. That, too, is an art. This idiom was presumably coined by someone resembling the fox with the grapes. However, once the courier has joined the cabinet, things change. The crowd, like a beloved, joyfully recognizes the lord and master after admitting him into the tiny chamber. I was presented in my service garb, a snug-fitting blue-striped linen suit, which is changed daily since no underwear is worn, plus babouches of yellow Safian leather. Their soft soles are comfortable and noiseless when I move behind the bar, where there is no carpet. Finally, the ludicrous cap, a small skiff that perches at a slant. The whole outfit is something between an official uniform and a jaunty get-up. My appearance is supposed to combine assiduity with cheerfulness. At the presentation, the Condor, in order to check my haircut, removed my skiff. While so doing, he punned on my name, but I have forgotten the exact wording. The gist of it was that he considered it possible and to be hoped for that someday Venator would become a senator. One has to mull over the words of the powerful. The Condors were open to various readings. In terms of the substance, he may have wanted to indicate the importance of my job. Of course, considering the ranks and honors to which some of his minions have risen, and why not? They would not be so pernickety with a knight steward. After all, Sixtus IV made his ephebes cardinals. However, the Condor may have meant it more personally. The positive attitude of the Venators, at least of my father and brother toward the tribunes, is well known in Eumeswil. While neither was politically active, both have always been Republicans out of conviction and inclination. The old man still has his position. My brother was removed from his because of impertinent remarks. Perhaps the allusion to a senator was meant to imply that my family should not rub off on me. Manuelo, this establishes a kind of godparenthood. At the same time, I received the phonophore with the narrow silver stripe, which identifies a post that is subaltern but within the tyrant's immediate entourage. 3. So much for my name and its variants. I also ought to go into detail about my profession. While it is correct to say that I am employed as night steward in the Kasbah, my job fills only certain gaps in my life. This can, no doubt, be inferred from my diction. It might prompt an attentive reader to surmise that I am basically a historian. A penchant for history and a vocation for historiography are hereditary in my lineage. This aptitude is based less on professional tradition than on genetic makeup. I need only cite my famous forebear Josiah Venator, whose magnum opus, Philip and Alexander, has long enjoyed prestige as a seminal contribution to the theory of social milieu. His tome has gone through numerous editions and was just recently republished here. Its preference for hereditary monarchy is undeniable. Hence, Eumeswil's historians and specialists in public law do not praise it unabashedly. Of course, the glory of Alexander the Great is supposed to reflect on the Condor as well, but his genius, like the phoenix, allegedly rose from the ashes. There are different reasons why my father and my brother, typical liberals, deal gingerly with Josiah. First of all, and this is understandable, they are perturbed by the way their ancestor is customized to fit current politics. Furthermore, an outstanding personality makes them squirm. Alexander strikes them as an elemental phenomenon, a lightning bolt that is sufficiently explained by the electrical charge between Europe and Asia. There are bizarre congruences between liberal and heroic historiography. Thus, for generations now, we have been producing historians. By way of exception, a theologian may come to the fore, or else a bohemian whose trail vanishes in obscurity. As for me, I managed to obtain my master's degree in a normal way. I was Vigo's assistant, and now, as his right arm, I deal with collaborative and also personal works. Moreover, I lecture and supervise the doctoral candidates. This may take a few more years, I am in no hurry to obtain tenure or become senator because I feel just fine. Aside from occasional depressions, I am well balanced, so one can comfortably let time pass. Time itself provides enjoyment. Therein presumably lies the secret of tobacco, indeed of any lighter drug. I can work on my topics at home or in Vigo's institute, or even in the Casbah, which I prefer because of its unsurpassable array of documents. I live here in the lap of luxury, and I would not be drawn to the city if the Condor tolerated women in the stronghold. They are not to be found even in the kitchen, nor can any laundress with whom one might have same discreet dalliance get past the guards. There are no exceptions. The married men have their families in the city. The Condor feels that the presence of women, whether young or old, would only promote intrigue. Still, it is hard to reconcile the rich diet and leisurely lifestyle with asceticism. My father did not like my studying under Vigo rather than under him, as my brother had done, but from our mealtime conversations I know what the old man has to offer, and besides, I regard Vigo as a far better historian. My genitor carps at him for being unscholarly, even journalistic. He thereby overlooks the true root of Vigo's strength. What does genius have to do with scholarship? Now I am not denying that the historian must rely on facts, but Vigo cannot be accused of neglecting them. We dwell here on a sheltered lagoon, where enormous masses of flotsam and jetsam from shipwrecks have been washed ashore. We know better than earlier generations anything that has ever happened anywhere on our planet. The material is stored in Vigo's mind down to the nicest details. He knows the facts, and he is able to teach his disciples how to evaluate them. In this respect, too, I have learned a lot from him. If the past has thereby been brought down to the present and re-erected like the ramparts of cities whose very names are forgotten, then we may say that decent work has been done. But Vigo, it must be pointed out, does not spirit anything into history. Rather, he leaves the ultimate questions open by presenting the questionable nature of events. When we look back, our eyes alight on graves and ruins, on a field of rubble. We are then inveigled by a mirage of time. While believing that we are advancing and progressing, we are actually moving toward that past. Soon we will belong to it. Time passes over us, and this sorrow overshadows the historian. As a researcher, he is nothing more than a burrower in parchments and graves, but then he asks the fateful question with the skull on his palm. Vigo's basic mood is well-founded sorrow. It appealed to my conviction that the world is imperfect. Vigo has a special method of cross-cutting through the past, that is, going non-chronologically. His is not so much the hunter's eye as the gardener's or botanist's. Thus he views our kinship with the plants as deeper than that with the animals, and he feels that at night we return to the woods, indeed all the way to the algae in the ocean. Among the animals, he says, the bees have rediscovered this kinship. Their mating with the flowers is neither a forward nor a backward step in evolution. It is a kind of supernova, a flashing of cosmogonic eros in a favorable conjunction. Even the boldest thinking has not yet hit on that, he says. The only things that are real are those that cannot be invented. Does he expect something similar in the human realm? As in every organically evolved work, his, too, contains more that is tacit than formulated. His reckoning has an unknown quantity. This places him in a predicament vis-à-vis people for whom everything works out evenly, including his students. I clearly remember the day that brought me close to him. It was after a lecture. The topic was plant cities. The course went on for 2 semesters. He compared the scattering of cultures over land and sea, over coasts, archipelagos, and oases, to the flight of seeds or the washing up of fruits along tide marks. When lecturing, Vigo usually holds up or simply clutches small objects, not as proof, but as vessels of a substance related to his topic, sometimes just a shard or a tiny fragment of brick. That morning, it was a faience plate with an arabesque motif of blossoms and handwriting. He pointed to the colors, a faded pattern of saffron, rose, and violet, and above it a shimmer created not by the glazing or the brush, but by time. Such are the dreams of glasses that were salvaged from Roman debris, or even tile roofs of hermitages that blazed and blazed do ring 1,000 summers. Vigo had arrived here by a tortuous path. He had started out from the coast of Asia Minor, which is so favorable to such a rooting in new soil. This had been demonstrated by the Phoenicians, the Greeks, by the Templars, the Venetians, and others. He has a preference for mercantile societies. Early on, they had blazed trails through deserts and oceans for salt, amber, pewter, and silk, and later for tea and spices. In Crete and Rhodes, in Florence and Venice, in Lusitanian and Netherlandish harbours, the treasures had accumulated like honey in combs. These treasures were transmuted into higher standards of living, into blisses, buildings, and artworks. The gold embodied the sun. Its hoarding enabled the arts to unfold and blossom. A touch of decay, of autumnal surfeit had to be added, and Vigo held the plate on his hand as if awaiting alms. How had he hit on Damascus and then the leap to Spain, through which Abdur Rahman had escaped being murdered? For almost 3 centuries, a branch of the Umayyads, who had been exterminated in Syria, flourished in Cordoba. Along with mosques, the faiences testified to this branch of Arabic civilization, a branch long since withered. And then there were the castles of the Beni Tahir in Yemen. A seed fell into the desert sand, managing to yield 4 harvests. The 5th Umayyad, an ancestor of Abdur Rahman, had dispatched Emir Musa to the Brass City. The caravan travelled from Damascus through Cairo and the Great Desert into the western lands and all the way to the coast of Mauritania. The goal was the copper flasks in which King Solomon had jailed rebellious demons. Now and again, the fishermen who cast their nets in the Ei-Karkar Sea would haul up one of these flasks in their catches. They were closed with the seal of Solomon. When they were opened, the demons spurted forth as smoke that darkened the sky. Emirs named Musa also recur subsequently in Granada and other residences of Moorish Spain. This emir, the conqueror of northwest Africa, may be regarded as their prototype. His western features are unmistakable. Of course, we must bear in mind that the distinctions between races and regions vanish on the peaks. Just as people resemble one another ethically, indeed become almost identical when approaching perfection, so too spiritually. The distance from the world and from the object increases. Curiosity grows, and with it the desire to get closer to the ultimate secrets, even amid great danger. This is an Aristotelian trait, one that makes use of arithmetic. It has not come down to us whether the emir felt any qualms about opening the flasks. From other accounts, we know that his step was risky. For instance, one of the imprisoned demons had sworn to himself that he would make the man who freed him the most powerful of mortals. He had spent hundreds of years thinking about how to make him happy. But then the demon's mood had soured. Gall and venom had concentrated in his dungeon. When a fisherman finally opened the flask centuries later, he would have suffered the fate of being ripped to shreds by the demon had he not resorted to a trick. Evil becomes all the more dreadful the longer it is deprived of air. In any case, Musa, needless to say, could not have recoiled from the unsealing. This is already evidenced by the uncommon boldness of his expedition through the wastelands. The aged Abdes Samad, who possessed the Book of Hidden Treasures and could read the stars, guided the caravan to the Brass City within 14 months. They rested in deserted castles and amid the graves in decaying cemeteries. At times they found water in wells that Iskander had dug while trekking westward. The Brass City was likewise dead and was enclosed by a ring wall. It took another 2 moons for blacksmiths and carpenters to build a ladder all the way to the battlements. Anyone who climbed up was blinded by a spell, so that he clapped his hands and, crying, "Thou art beautiful," plunged down. 12 of Musa's companions perished, one after another, until at last Abdes Samad succeeded in resisting the witchcraft by incessantly calling out Allah's name while clambering up, and after he reached the top, reciting the verses of salvation. Under the mirage, as under a watery surface, he saw the shattered bodies of his predecessors. Said Musa, "If that's how a rational man acts, what will a madman do?" The sheikh then descended through one of the turrets and, from the inside, opened the gates of the necropolis. However, it was not these adventures, although they have their secret meaning, that prompts the mention of Emir Musa. Rather, it was his encounter with the historical world which becomes a phantasm vis-à-vis the reality of the fairy tale. The emir had the poet Thalib read aloud the inscriptions on the monuments and on the walls of the deserted palaces. Ah, where are they whose strength has built all these with unbelievably lofty balconies? Where are the Persian shahs in castles tall? They left their land, it did forget them all. Where are the men who ruled the vast countries, Sind and Hind, the proud hosts of dynasties, to whom Senj and Habesh did bend their will, and Nubia when it was rebellious still? Await no tiding now from any tomb, no knowledge is forthcoming from its womb. The times changed, weaving death from every loom. The citadels they built brought naught but doom. These verses filled Musa with such profound sorrow that life became a burden for him. As they wandered through the rooms, they came to a table carved out of yellow marble, or, according to other reports, cast in Chinese steel. There, the following words were notched in Arabic letters. At this table 1,000 kings have dined whose right eyes were blind, and 1,000 others whose left eyes were blind. They have all passed on, and now they populate the graves and catacombs. When Thalib read these words aloud to him, everything went dark before Musa's eyes. He shrieked and rent his garment. Then he had the verses and inscriptions copied down. Seldom has the historian's pain been captured so vehemently. It is the human pain that was felt long before any scholarship, accompanying man ever since he dug the first graves. Anyone who writes history would like to preserve the names and their meanings, indeed rediscover the names of cities and nations that are long forgotten. It is like placing flowers on a grave. Ye dead, and also ye nameless, princes and warriors, slaves and evildoers, saints and whores, do not be mournful, ye are remembered lovingly. But this thinking too is limited by time, to which it succumbs. Every monument weathers away, and the wreath is cremated along with the corpse. Why is it that we nevertheless refuse to give up this ritual? We could make do with Omar the tent-maker, join him in drinking the wine of Shiraz down to the dregs, and then tossing away the earthen beaker, dust to dust. Will ever any custodian open their graves, any cockcrow wake them to the light? It must be thus, and the historian's sorrow, his torment, are among the indications. He sits in judgment over the dead when the merrymaking that roared around the powerful has long since hushed, when their triumphs and their victims, their grandeur and their infamy are forgotten, and yet only an indication. The torment, the anxiety of the historical human being, his tireless labor with imperfect means in an ephemeral world, this could not be felt, could not be achieved without a directive to create this indication. The loss of perfection can be felt only if perfection exists. This is the goal of the indication, of the trembling of the quill in the hand. The compass needle quivers because a pole exists. In its atoms, the needle is kin to the pole. As the word is weighed by the poet, so too must the deed be weighed by the historian, beyond good and evil, beyond any conceivable ethics. As the muses are evoked by the poem, so too must the Norns be evoked here. They appear in front of the table. Now the room grows still. The graves open up. Here, too, there are grave robbers who, for the sake of the market, falsify poems and deeds. So it is better to carouse with Omar Khayyam than to join them in violating the dead. 4. At this point, there was a scraping of feet in the auditorium. I could already half hear it from the corridor, for I had softly opened the door in order to leave. Afterwards, in the library, Vigo asked me about it. So, did you also find what you were hearing too antiquated? I shook my head. On the contrary, the lecture had moved me too deeply. It stirred my own preoccupation, my own torment. I do not know whether I have sketched it correctly. Vigo has an enormous supply of images, which he weaves into his speech as though plucking them out of thin air. They envelop his train of thought without disturbing it, thereby recalling trees that bear their blossoms directly on their trunks. I contented myself, as I have mentioned, with shaking my head. It is better, especially among men, for emotions to be guessed rather than verbalized. I sensed that he understood me. This was the moment that established our friendship. Evidently, my fellow students had not noticed what had seized hold of me. This happens when a circuit closes between two human beings. They had laughed at certain points, for instance, upon hearing the word moons. They are quick to laugh. It makes them feel superior. They regarded moons, like all of Vigo's lecture, as antiquated. For them, timeliness is of the essence. No doubt they had failed to realize that Vigo was quoting from an old text based on Gallen's translation of the 1001 Nights. Aside from that, moons is, of course, phonetically, grammatically, logically preferable to months. Moons is now tainted because trivial writers have flogged it to death. I would therefore avoid using it. Vigo is above such qualms. He could restore the prestige of language. In any other time but ours, when people no longer take one another seriously, his true rank would have been recognized despite some crotchets. While strict and unyielding about facts, he is personally quite sensitive. Naturally, he could say anything in any way, even the grossest drivel, if he were with it. But his substance prevents him. It forces him to be honest. He could not, even if willingly, twist the facts to his advantage. Whenever a highly cultured man has harmonized with the zeitgeist, it has always been a happy fluke, a rare exception. Nowadays one had best stick with the ancient sage, to keep from falling victim to a thief. Conceal thy gold, thine absence, thy belief. This is practiced even by the rulers. They don the little smocks of all trades. The condor, though able to take all sorts of liberties, is likewise cautious. A night steward can judge this. A teacher does best, as things stand, to limit himself to the natural sciences and the realm of their practical applications. In anything that goes further, say literature, philosophy, history, he is on thin ice, particularly if he is suspected of having a metaphysical background. These are the suspicions with which two sorts of faculty members operate here. They are either crooks disguised as professors or professors posing as crooks in order to gain popularity. They try to outdo one another in the race for infamy, yet there is honor among thieves. Still, should a genius like Vigo wander into their circle, he is treated like a magpie. They dose ranks against the intruder. It is bizarre the way they band together as if threatened with annihilation. The students, though basically good-natured, get their watchwords from these teachers. I do not wish to go into quisquiliae. In the analysis of history, two main perspectives crystallize, one of which is directed at men, the other at might. This also corresponds to a rhythm in politics. Monarchies, oligarchies, dictatorships, tyranny as opposed to democracies, republics, the oklos, anarchy. The captain as opposed to the crew, the great leader as opposed to the collective. For insiders, needless to say, these antitheses are necessary yet also illusory. They are motives serving to wind up the dock of history. Only seldom does a great noon shine, making the antitheses dissolve in happiness. After the condor's triumph over the tribunes, men are once again held in high esteem here. In this respect, the condor himself acts more liberal than the professors, who try to fawn on him at any price, the younger ones out of sheer stupidity, the older ones, who taught during the tribunate, out of well-founded prudence. One can do studies here as in a waxworks. For example, a young lecturer is presented with a theory that is alien to him, perhaps even unpleasant. Fashion compels him to deal with it. He is won over. We could not object, though his conversion per se is not quite decent. But then he starts behaving like an adolescent who fails to distinguish between when to enthuse and when to think. He takes on authoritarian and soon also dangerous characteristics. The university is filled with such half-wits who poke their noses everywhere and make mischief, giving off a repulsive, stable stench whenever they get together. Once they hold the reins, these lecturers, ignorant of what power is about, lose all sense of moderation. Eventually, the army boot arrives. At present, they are held in check by the condor and his major domo, and so they limit their hunting to victims whom they believe to be in disrepute. Vigo is one such target. Since men are making history again, his preferences, say for merchants who hire soldiers, are considered decadent. But those people fail to see that his ideal is cultural achievement. Thus, the Carthaginians, although they too had mercenaries do their fighting, are not to his taste. Basically, it is beauty that he serves. Power and riches should be its thralls. Perhaps in this respect he is more closely related to the condor, at least his night side, than he realizes. Vigo, being, as I have said, sensitive, takes this professorial infighting tragically, although it is no threat to his safety. To be sure, extremely importunate persecutorial types thrive in our putrid lagoon. Each student is a viper nursed in the bosom, Vigo once said to me in a gloomy moment when speaking about Barbasoro, who, granted, belongs more to the species of purebred rats. The purebred rat is highly intelligent, obliging, hard-working, flexible, and endowed with subtle empathy. This is the luster of its life, predestining it as a teacher's pet. Unfortunately, and this is inherent in its nature, it cannot resist the lure of the pack. It hears the whistle, and even if the prey is the venerated master himself, the rat joins the throng that pounces on him. The rat is especially dangerous because of its knowledge and the intimate wisdom it has gained by associating with the master. It becomes the lead rat. Vigo's critique of the zeitgeist is so intricately encoded as to be virtually indecipherable. By the way, critique is not quite accurate. Rather, it is his character that is considered almost opaque. If everyone is moving and in the same direction at that, whether right or left, whether up or down, the stationary person is in the way. He is taken as a reproach, and since people collide with him, they brand him as the offender. Motion seeks to transform facts into opinion, then into conviction, and anyone hewing to the facts themselves is shown, against his will, in an adverse light. This is quite possible in a faculty where after every overthrow world history is to be rewritten for the sake of the moment. Textbooks wear out, they no longer grow obsolete. To make someone with Vigo's mind vulnerable requires a certain intelligence. His sheer existence is felt as an immediate nuisance. The blockheads have an unerring instinct for such things. All they need do is prove that this nuisance is insignificant and yet also dangerous. Such evidence is presented by scholars of Kessmuller's ilk. These are the truffle pigs that grub up the delicacy. Then the rats pounce upon it. Kessmuller, a bald-headed homosexual, has studied Vigo thoroughly. Kessmuller's ideas are as non-existent as his hair. He is a bon vivant and a gourmet, and has a sense of humor. As a humanist, he is above suspicion. He could also earn his money as a master of ceremonies at the Calamaretto, and he plays the entertainer at academic soirees. His talent has gotten him through various, even antithetical regimes as a king of the herrings, which shines on the surface. He has an instinct for conformity and for irresistible platitudes, which he stylizes in a highbrow manner. He can also reinterpret them depending on which way the wind is blowing. A hedonist. Materially, he feels more at home with the condor, materialistically with the tribunes. In his lectures, he seldom neglects to quote Vigo, whereby his face is voluptuously transfigured. A good comic appeals by his very appearance, by the comical per se. Kessmuller can transform himself like a chameleon, slipping out of the pedagogue's costume into the pantaloons with no other transition than a brief silence. It is as if he were performing at a Mardi Gras. An expectant mood spreads through the auditorium before he so much as opens his mouth. A few of the students can barely choke back their mirth. I attended his course if only to study this sleight of hand. Oddly enough, he scarcely twists his face. The audience laughs. One is reminded of telepathy. Kessmuller is an orator who knows the secret of pauses. Then he begins to quote Vigo, a sentence or even a paragraph, from memory. Sometimes he acts as if he has just had a brainstorm. He pulls out a book to read aloud, which then sounds, to use the apothecary's term, casually compounded, but is actually well prepared. He moves his finger to and fro, apparently seeking the passage which he has carefully marked. Vigo's name is not mentioned, but everyone in the auditorium knows what's what. The excerpts, though wrenched out of context, are presented verbatim. Kessmuller is aware of his responsibility to scholarship. Nor does he act as if he were quoting from a comical text. At most, words like moons are stressed pleasurably. He also likes emphasizing high and higher in this fashion, and beautiful, like a clown putting on a red nose. This borders on persiflage, which ranges from slight parody to crude nastiness. Kessmuller cultivates it as an art, nor is it a coincidence that he extracts passages from Vigo's texts that I particularly love. At a cabaret by the wharves, there is a lampooner who recites poems farcically as if they were being yiddled by Rabbi Taiteles or squeezed out by someone sitting on a toilet. He chooses classical texts, twisting his mouth like Kessmuller. Oddly enough, the listeners seem familiar with the poems. They must have learned them at school, otherwise there would be no cause for merriment. I owe to Vigo one of the geological findings in Eumeswil, feller-like swamping on an Alexandrian foundation. The substratum was Alexandrian knowledge on a classical foundation. Thus, values keep growing more and more shallow. First they were present, then still respected, and finally annoying. For Kessmuller, the very word value is suspect. Before our times, they still had an afterglow, but the stove is cold. It no longer even warms the hands. No salvation comes from exhumed gods. We must penetrate deeper into substance. If I take a fossil, say a trilobite, in my hand, marvelously preserved specimens are found in the quarries at the foot of the Kasbah, I am transfixed by the impact of mathematical harmony. Purpose and beauty, as fresh as on the first day, are still seamlessly united in a medal engraved by a master's hand. The bios must have discovered the secret of tripartition in this primordial crab. Tripartition then frequently recurs, even without any natural kinship. Figures in transversal symmetry dwell in the triptych. How many millions of years ago might this creature have animated an ocean that no longer exists? I hold its impression, a seal of imperishable beauty, in my hand. Someday this seal too will decay or else burn out in cosmic conflagrations of the future. The matrix that formed it remains concealed in and operative from the law, untouched by death or fire. I feel my hand warming. If the creature were still alive, it would perceive my warmth like the cat whose fur I stroke. But not even the stone into which it was transformed can escape this. The molecules expand. A bit further, a bit more strongly. It would stir in my hand as in a daydream. I cannot vault the barrier, but I sense that I am on the right path. 5. This harassment was repulsive, but Vigo overly dignified it by letting it get to him. Sometimes when I ran into him at the library or dropped by in his garden, I found him pale and shunning the light, like an owl hiding in a hollow. If it ventures out into the light, the crows will pounce upon it. I tried to raise his spirits by highlighting his prowess and his mission. I did not lack for arguments. Vigo must have realized, and also knew from his eminent command of history, that this sort of cheap persecution underscored the opponent's weakness and Vigo's strength. His freedom is a rebuke, a thorn in the flesh of these half-cadavers, who therefore never tire of dealing with him even though he is devoid of any aggressivity. He did not endorse the tribunes, nor does he now support the condor. He is irked by both. He will not fall in with any regime. Forms of government for him are like thin skins that keep scaling incessantly. The state as such, independent of metamorphoses, nay, bringing them about, is a great entity, a criterion for him. He favors certain polities without committing himself to any, especially a current one. In contrast, he is fascinated by the way they replace each other out of the substance of history. Men and powers have followed one another as if the world's spirit has gotten fed up with each in turn after exhausting it, always unsatisfactorily. Here, doctrines, ideas, ideals. There, more or less clearly defined individuals. Highly advanced civilization, a lull as if the will were fading, has always been possible both here and there. Cosmetic beauty broke through the structure, above all before it hardened or after it developed cracks. Both the overture and the finale concentrate the motif. The second possibility appears to stimulate Vigo more strongly because the gods are no longer so powerful. Their variety and that of the states are more advantageous. Here the palate, there monotony. The Romans are exemplary for the state, the Greeks for civilization. Rome had the Colosseum, Greece the Parthenon. Why do you want to impress Kessmuller, much less debate with him? It will only provide him with material for his comedy. The Domo's materialism is realistic, that of his predecessors was rationalistic. Both are superficial, meant for political use. Hair splitters could get more under the tribunes. That was why Kesmuller harmonized with them more easily. However, his deft contortions in adjusting to the condor are no table. My brother and my genitor were less successful. This touches upon the distinction between the threadbare liberal and the shallow doctrinarian who lives on promises. Everything becomes evolution. Progress turns into the earthly paradise. It can be extended ad infinitum. You should also regard such figures as temple custodians, whose grimaces at least keep the worst blockheads away from you. Would you like this smug complacency to spread through your courses too? Such minds have to be sought in the places of their belief, among their gods. That is where a rouged workaday routine and the day feat become obvious. Vigo, like my genitor, incidentally, presumes that people still venerate objective knowledge. But how can that be, amid the universal loss of respect? He still lives in times when a theatre, a parade, a bestowal of honor, an act of parliament, even a lecture could be a celebration. How would this be possible without a delight in celebrations? Then there is Vigo's pedagogical passion, which is utterly lacking in me, even though presumably I, too, will someday become a full professor. Not that I do not consider myself capable of that. I could afford to be tenured, like a man who becomes a general because that has been customary in his family since time immemorial. He possesses the required technique. He knows how to train troops. He has the hang of it. That is why he can occupy that rank in any regime, even completely antithetical ones, and why he suddenly shows up on the enemy side, as is virtually the rule among revolutionary generals. His passion remains untouched, as was the case with Jomini, who, in the thick of battle, cried out, "Damn it all, now I wish I were commanding on the other side. What a festival that would be!" The same goes for the historian. The less committed he is, the less biased his judgment. Eumeswil is good soil for that. A man who knows his craft is appreciated anywhere and any time. This is also one of the means of survival for the aristocrat, whose diplomatic instinct is almost irreplaceable. I must thrash this out with Ingrid for her postdoctoral dissertation after one of our Icelandic embraces. The vaguer the substratum on which he moves, the stronger the expert. No more bonds, no more biases. The power rises from the base to the exponents. The man with the least amount of ethical and ethnic baggage is the matador of quick spins and chameleon-like transformations. The great spy is the one who embodies this most purely. This is no coincidence. With every master spy, a counter-spy too is born. This lies deeper than race, class, or country. One senses it, and also expresses it wherever things are still halfway intact. Schwarzkoppen viewed Esterhazy only through his monocle, and Prince Urusov refused to shake Azev's hand. Inner neutrality. A man is involved wherever and for as long as he likes. When the bus is no longer comfortable, he gets out. Jomini, if I'm not mistaken, was Swiss, a condottiere as in the Renaissance, a high-level mercenary. I intend to pinpoint the details at the Luminar or ask Ingrid to do so. A general is a specialist insofar as he has mastered his craft. Beyond that, and outside the arbitrary pro and con, he keeps a third possibility intact and in reserve, his own substance. He knows more than what he embodies and teaches, has other skills along with the ones for which he is paid. He keeps all that to himself. It is his property. It is set aside for his leisure, his soliloquies, his nights. At a propitious moment, he will put it into action, tear off his mask. So far he has been racing well. Within sight of the finish line, his final reserves start pouring in. Fate challenges him. He responds. The dream, even in an erotic encounter, comes true. But casually, even here, every goal is a transition for him. The bow should snap rather than aiming the arrow at a finite target. General stands here for the individual who goes into action, whether freely or forcedly. Since anarchy offers him an especially favorable charge, this type is permanent today. Thus, general has a universal rather than a special meaning. It can be replaced ad libitum. It refers not to a profession but to a condition. The latter may also crop up in a coolie, in which case it is particularly effective. Vigo has great reserves at his disposal, but he does not deploy them correctly. He fritters them away by trying to get them across and then expects their true value to be requited. Does anyone flash money in obscure taverns? It looks suspicious, yet a tip is gratefully accepted. A pittance suffices. He is not unaware of his own worth, but he cannot translate it into currency of the realm. A prince in the domain of the mind rummages through his pockets, looking for change. When I became his assistant and then his friend, my chief task, as I saw it, was not in serving the Luminar, but in forming a circle around Vigo, a circle where not everything would be dropped, a small group worthy of him. He who seeks shall find, nor does Eumeswil lack spiritually homesick people, if only 1 in 100 or in 1,000. 3, 5, or 7 students were enough for an afternoon in the garden or an evening symposium at which Vigo felt fine. Ingrid, who took over my job, also joined in. We attempted to keep these things a secret. Invitations to tea, to an outing, a chance encounter among the graves, not even thought of as a private tutorial. Nevertheless, the rumors could not be avoided, as always when a few people cut themselves off. I was approached by individuals who were curious, or else eager for knowledge, so I could pick and choose. There were hours when the portals of history were flung wide, the tombs opened up, the dead came with their sufferings, their delights, the sum of which always remains the same. They were conjured up to the light of the sun, which shone on them as on us. A ray struck their foreheads. I felt its warmth, as if the trilobite were stirring in my hand. We were allowed to share their hope. It was the eternally dashed hope that is handed down from generation to generation. They sat among us, often friend and foe were barely distinguishable. We could thrash out their quarrels. We became their advocates, and each one was in the right. We shook hands. They were empty. But we passed it on. The wealth of the world. We were sitting together in the garden. It was late. The full moon loomed behind the Kasbah, which sliced into its disk like a signet. The dome and the minaret were sharply inscribed. Now and then, one of us would leave the circle for a breath of air, as I did after the lecture on Emir Musa and the Brass City. At last it seemed to overcome even Vigo, not exhaustion, for his face was aglow. He rose to his feet. "Children, let me be alone." 6. Until now I've spoken about my name and profession. I now ought to go into detail about my political reliability. It is indisputable. How else could I be employed in the Condor's innermost circle within his reach? I carry the phonophore with the silver stripe. Naturally, I was probed and grilled, picked out and sieved out. While I have little regard for psychologists, indeed for technology in toto, I must admit that they know their business. They are cunning fellows who never fail to catch anyone with oblique ideas, much less oblique intentions. They start out in a comfortable, leisurely fashion after the physicians have scrutinized the candidate's physis and the police his background. This investigation goes all the way back to his grandfather's. While the psychologists chat with him over a cup of tea, others listen to his voice, observe his gestures, his face. You grow chummy, you come out of your shell. Your reactions are registered imperceptibly, your heartbeat, your blood pressure, the shock with its pause after a name or a question. Furthermore, they have psychometers that old Reichenbach would have envied. They develop pictures on which yellow or violet auras radiate horn the forehead, the hair, the fingertips. The borderline areas that were metaphysical for the ancient philosophers are parapsychological for them, and they find it praiseworthy to get at them with numbers and measurements. Needless to say, they also resort to drugs and hypnosis. A droplet in the tea, which they also sip, a speck of pollen, and we are no longer in Eumeswil, but in the mountains of Mexico. Should friendly neighbors, say from Cappadocia or Mauritania, smuggle in an agent or even an assassin, he would be exposed within 3 days. Far more dangerous are the wily emissaries of the Yellow Khan and the Blue Khan. There is no way to prevent them from settling at the harbor or in the city, haunting those places until they eventually make a careless error. But they never penetrate the interior of the Kasbah. My case did not cause the committee any headaches. There was no problem. I am, if I say so myself, anything but oblique. I am as straight as an arrow, going neither right nor left, neither up nor down, neither east nor west. I am perfectly balanced. Granted, I deal with these antitheses, but only in history, not in current events. I am not committed. It is well known that my father and my brother sympathized with the tribunes, albeit moderately, and also not without discreet criticism. That was the rule in Eumeswil. There was virtually no exception. And why should there be? After all, a baker, a composer, or a professor has more important concerns than making political waves. Above all, he wants to ply his trade, practice his art, do his job without losing the best years of his life. He simply wants to survive by hook or by crook. Moreover, he is easy to replace. Others are already lurking in the wings. Aside from that, such types are also more useful to the successor than the upright souls who remain true to the idea, holding the banner aloft, and generally merit the praise that has passed from military lingo into the jargon of civil war. They cut their finest figure in their obituaries. As survivors, they soon become unpleasant again. The examiners know that. Enthusiasm is suspect. Hence, I earned points by expressing myself objectively as a historian in regard to the Condor. I believe that under the influence of a hard drug, I said, he is not a leader of the people. He is a tyrant. They know that unconditional devotion is dangerous. A politician, an author, an actor are venerated from a distance. At last you get to meet your idol, and as a person he cannot live up to expectations. Your mood then easily swings. You have had an incredible stroke of luck. You have succeeded in gaining admission to the diva's bedroom, and disappointment is not long in coming. With clothes, divinity also drops away. Eros is strongest in the unexpected, the unforeseen. They found no mischief in me. I remained normal, however deeply they probed, and also straight as an arrow. To be sure, normality seldom coincides with straightness. Normalcy is the human constitution. Straightness is logical reasoning. With its help, I could answer satisfactorily. In contrast, the human element is at once so general and so intricately encoded that they fail to perceive it, like the air they breathe. Thus, they were unable to penetrate my fundamental structure, which is anarchic. That sounds complicated, but is simple, for everyone is anarchic. This is precisely what is normal about us. Of course, the anarchic is hemmed in from the very first day by father and mother, by state and society. Those are prunings, tappings of the primordial strength, and nobody escapes them. One has to resign oneself. But the anarchic remains at the very bottom as a mystery, usually unknown even to its bearer. It can erupt from him as lava, can destroy him, liberate him. Distinctions must be drawn here. Love is anarchy, marriage is not. The warrior is anarchic, the soldier is not. Manslaughter is anarchic, murder is not. Christ is anarchic, St. Paul is not. Since, of course, the anarchic is normal, it is also present in St. Paul, and sometimes it erupts mightily from him. Those are not antitheses, but degrees. The history of the world is moved by anarchy. In sum, the free human being is anarchic, the anarchist is not. If I were an anarchist and nothing further, they would have easily exposed me. They are particularly geared toward detecting anyone who tries to approach the powerful with mischievous intent, with a dagger in his cloak. The anarch can lead a lonesome existence. The anarchist is sociable and must get together with peers. Like any other place, Eumeswil has its share of anarchists. They are divided into two sects, the good-natured and the ill-natured. The good-natured are not dangerous. They dream of golden ages. Rousseau is their patron saint. The others have pledged their allegiance to Brutus. They convene in basements and garrets, and also in a back room of the Calamaretto. They huddle together like Philistines, drinking their beer, while nurturing an indecent secrecy that is revealed by a giggle. They are listed in the police registers. When cells have to start forming and chemists get to work, they are watched more sharply. The boil will soon burst. Those words are by the Major Domo Major, nicknamed Domo by the Condor. I retain the abbreviation. Before an assassination can take place, either arrests are made or the conspiracy is steered. Against an opposition that is gaining a foothold, no weapon is more potent than blaming the group for an assassination attempt. The anarchist's hazy idealism, his goodness without sympathy or else his sympathy without goodness, makes him serviceable in many ways and also useful for the police. He does sense a secret, but he can do no more than sense it. The tremendous strength of the individual. It intoxicates him. He spends himself like a moth burning up in a flame. The absurdity of the assassination attempt lies not in the doer and his self-assurance, but in the deed and its link with the fleeting situation. The doer has sold himself too cheaply. That is why he usually achieves the opposite of what he intends. The anarchist is dependent both on his unclear desires and on the powers that be. He trails the powerful man as his shadow. The ruler is always on his guard against him. As Charles V stood on a tower with his retinue, a captain began to laugh. When interrogated, he admitted to thinking that if he embraced the emperor and plunged down with him, his name would be forever recorded in history. The anarchist is the antagonist of the monarch, whom he dreams of wiping out. He gets the man and consolidates the succession. The ism suffix has a restrictive meaning. It emphasizes the will at the expense of the substance. I owe this note to Tofern, the grammarian, a hair-splitter par excellence. The positive counterpart of the anarchist is the anarch. The latter is not the adversary of the monarch, but his antipode, untouched by him, though also dangerous. He is not the opponent of the monarch, but his pendant. After all, the monarch wants to rule many, nay, all people, the anarch only himself. This gives him an attitude both objective and skeptical toward the powers that be. He has their figures go past him, and he is untouched, no doubt, yet inwardly not unmoved, not without historical passion. Every born historian is more or less an anarch. If he has greatness, then on this basis he rises without partisanship to the judge's bench. This concerns my profession, which I take seriously. I am also the night steward in the Kasbah. Now, I am not saying that I take this job less seriously. Here I am directly involved in the events. I deal with the living. My anarchic principle is not detrimental to my work. Rather, it substantiates it as something I have in common with everyone else, except that I am conscious of this. I serve the condor, who is a tyrant. That is his function, just as mine is to be his steward. Both of us can retreat to substance, to human nature in its nameless condition. When, in the course of my work at the Luminar, I was reviewing public law from Aristotle to Hegel and beyond, I thought of an Anglo-Saxon's axiom about human equality. He seeks it not in the ever-changing distribution of power and means, but in a constant, the fact that anyone can kill anyone else. This is a platitude, albeit reduced to a striking formula. The possibility of killing someone else is part of the potential of the anarch whom everyone carries around inside himself, though he is seldom aware of that possibility. It always slumbers in the underground, even when two people exchange greetings in the street or avoid each other. When one stands atop a tower or in front of an oncoming train, that possibility is already drawing closer. Aside from the technological dangers, we also register the nearness of the other. He can even be my brother. An old poet, Edgar Allan Poe, grasped this geometrically in A Descent into the Maelstrom. In any case, we watch our backs. Then comes the thronging in the catastrophe, the raft of the Medusa, the starving in the lifeboat. That Englishman boiled it down to a mechanistic formula. Experience with civil war contributed to it. This leads further down than Descartes. The zoological operates still beneath the human, and the law of physics operates further down. Ethics, instinct, and sheer kinetics dictate our actions. Our cells are composed of molecules and the latter of atoms. I want to indicate this only insofar as it concerns my service. In any event, I brought this knowledge into the condor's range, into the inner sanctum that Monseigneur described as his parvulo. I can kill him, dramatically or discreetly. His beverages, he especially loves a light red wine, ultimately pass through my hands. Now, granted, it is unlikely that I would kill him, albeit not impossible. Who can tell what astrological conjunctions one may get involved in? So for now, my knowledge is merely theoretical, though important insofar as it puts me on his level. Not only can I kill him, I can also grant him amnesty. This is in my hands. Naturally, I would not try to strike him just because he is a tyrant. I am too well versed in history, especially the model that we have attained in Eumeswil. An immoderate tyrant settles his own hash. The execution can be left to the anarchists. That is all they think about. Hence tyranny is seldom bequeathed. Unlike the monarchies, it barely endures beyond the grandson. Parmenides inherited tyranny from his father, like a disease. According to Thales, the rarest thing he encountered in his travels was an old tyrant. That is my basic attitude in performing my job, and perhaps I do so better than any number of others. I am his equal. The difference lies in the clothing and the ceremonies which only blockheads despise. You doff your clothes only when things start getting serious. My awareness of my equality is actually good for my work. I am free enough to perform it lightly and agreeably, as if dancing. Often it gets late, and if things have gone well, I pat myself on the back before dosing the bar, like a performer whose act has succeeded. The powerful appreciate this mood, especially at the parvulo. The free and easy atmosphere in the space increases their enjoyment. Of course, Shiz atmosphere must be dosed out. Needless to say, I do not imbibe even if I am offered a drink, which happens if the Yellow Khan is our guest, at which time caution is in order. I also let the conversation pass over me, although I follow it attentively and am often enthralled. My smile is detached. It is part of my job, but I do not join the mirth triggered by a punchline. I weave a tapestry. I may presume that the condor is satisfied with me. His "Good night, Manuelo," when he leaves the bar, sounds benevolent. At times he inquires about my studies. He has historical sympathies, say, with the era of the Diadochi. This is natural in Eumeswil. He also seems fascinated by the history of maritime battles. Before coming to power, he briefly commanded the navy. The overthrow started with the bombardment of the city from the ocean side. The intermezzo left him with a kind of dilettantish passion for seascapes. At the Kasbah, he seems to feel as if he were on a ship sailing through time. I order the beverages from the galley, stewards do the serving in the mess hall. The dome of the Kasbah resembles a captain's bridge. There are no women on board. He began his career in the infantry. His father was a corporal, a soldier of fortune. I once heard a conversation between him and the domo, who always sits at his right. They were discussing the reliability of the troops. The prize, they said, went to the foot soldiers. Next came the cuirassiers. There was no banking on the hussars. These comparisons extended to the sailors and the aviators. The domo, in charge of security, had obviously also pondered this issue in theoretical terms. The faster someone can move, the more closely he has to be watched. 7. The conversation was also theoretical in that there is scarcely such a thing as troops here. Eumeswil, with its territory and its islands, forms an oasis between the Diadochian kingdoms of the great Khans and some epigonic city-states. In the north, our territory borders on the ocean. Depending on my mood, I sometimes believe it is the Mediterranean and sometimes the Atlantic. Toward the south, our territory vanishes in the desert. This area is patrolled by scouting parties. The desert is followed by steppes, tangled chaparral, jungles, which have grown even denser after the sudden bursts of fire, and finally the ocean again. There are different types of hunting in these regions. It is mainly owing to the abundance of game that the Yellow Khan keeps his hand over Eumeswil. He comes annually with a large retinue. The preparations for his visits are the most important aspect of our foreign policy. A hunt must be staged through every zone, all the way to the big game of the steppes beyond. We also have to think up interludes, surprises for a jaded ruler with an iron constitution and an insatiable lust. I fill the quiver with strenuousness and exhaust it with enjoyment. There must be a close kinship between the chased and the chaser. The hunting masters have totem heads. The Grand Louvetier, the master of the wolf hunt, has a wolf's face. One can guess who hunts the lion, the buffalo, the boar, not to mention the movements and the stature. I do not wish to generalize, however, for aside from correspondences, there are also compliments. Thus, the Yellow Khan opens the elephant hunt by sending out dwarves who sneak up to the animal with naked blades. On the whole, his venery is archaic, almost without powder or optical aids. Though cruel to human beings, he observes noble rules in regard to game. The great hunt ends at the impenetrable southern jungle. The latter supposedly harbors species of game that have never been sighted by human eyes and that one hears about only through rumors. Most people consider them the mirages of adventurers who dared to enter the wilderness and returned with a deadly fever. However, it appears that this is precisely where the Khan dreams of crowning his venery. He hires scouts, especially those dwarves who are unsurpassed in reading tracks, plus scholars who do not fit in at any faculty, half mythologists, half interpreters of dreams, who are derided not only by Rosner as a zoologist, but also by my genitor. He compares them to the alchemists who once offered to make gold for rulers. The simile is not bad. In either case, transmutation means the great hope, the ever-frustrated dream. There can be no doubt that surprises lurk in the jungle. Now and then, new fauna and often new flora are brought in from its outskirts. They have confirmed a number of rumors that have been treated as fables since the age of Herodotus. But that is not the point. Scholars used to believe that after the great floods, there were not only new species emerging, but also new genera. The role of water has now been taken over by fire. Blazing curtains separate the metamorphoses. When I am at the Luminar, skimming through tomes that were printed before the time of the great Linnaeus, I stumble upon creatures that obviously existed only in the imagination, yet were so deeply entrenched as to be depicted, say, the unicorn, the winged serpent, the satyr, the mermaid. Scholars suspected the forest in particular of harboring strange things, and they described them. Thus, a certain Dr. Gesner wrote about the forest demon, a wondrous creature, a quadruped with spurred heels, a wreath of breasts, and a human head. Supposedly he was captured in a Salzburg diocese during the year 1531 of the Christian era, but died within days because he refused all nourishment. This reminds me of an adventure that frightened Periander, who strikes me as sharing a number of features with the condor. One of Periander's herders showed him a creature that he was carrying under his cloak. It had been foaled by a mare, a colt with a human head. Periander sent for Thales and asked his opinion. Thales advised him not to have the horses tended by herders unless they were married. Back then, the mythical age was not so remote that people were skeptical about the possibility of such births. And today, in Eumeswil, knowledge has brought them close to us again. It is as if the snake were biting its own tail. These notes are no quaint digression. They are directly relevant. For their sake, I have to keep an eye on Attila, who sits at the condor's left, especially late at night. If anyone knows what goes on in the woods, it is he. Apparently, he has also gained intimacy there with drugs and remedies. Previously, he had already mastered their synthetic structure. As cupbearer, I have to deal with him when he prescribes certain admixtures for the condor or his guests. He resorts, I notice, to wonder drugs that, being attributed to superstition, have long since vanished from the dispensaries. Thus, I have to blend certain drinks in the shell of the coco de mer, a palm fruit that drifts ashore in the coves of Sumatra and was once said to come from a tree that grows on the ocean floor. Others opined that the griffin carried it there. Goldsmiths would mount such a shell as a drinking vessel. It was regarded as an infallible specific against even the strongest poison. Attila seems to believe in the virtue of the unicorn as well. This could be his totem animal. Today it is known that the twisted stern belongs not to a white horse concealed in the darkness of the woods, but to a whale in the North Sea. The stem was preserved in treasuries. When the physicians had left a dying man's bed, a pinch was shaved off this horn and served to him in a cup of wine. The mandrake, with which I deal more often, is considered no less precious. It serves as an outright miracle drug, especially for increasing virility. Supposedly, the Yellow Khan in particular is indebted to it for Herculean achievements in this area. It is a treat for grand seigneurs, since extensive precautions are required for finding roots of the proper size and substance. The wild plant, the only potent kind, grows sporadically in the wildernesses around Kukunor. There it is called ginseng. Anyone who knows of an occurrence keeps it a secret. He marks the spot and digs up the mandragora at the right time under a full moon. Here in the bar, the root is kept under lock and key, for the Chinese cooks crave it the way opium eaters crave their stuff. I have a code word for the cocktail to which I add it. When the Khan asks for it late at night, then the lupanars on the western periphery are in for a Mongolian storm. 8. While I was still wavering about accepting the position, it was Vigo who strongly urged me to take it. "Martin, you will see things that will be inestimable for you." He was referring to the observation of the manner in which power issues are weighed and played out, immediate insight into the methods as demonstrated on a practical model. A spectacle was beckoning to the historian, especially at the parvulo. Vigo distinguishes between the surgeon's eye and the anatomist's. The one wishes to operate, the other only delves into the condition. The former's time is measured, while the latter has all the time in the world. Eumeswil is particularly advantageous for the historian because no living values are left. The historical material has consumed itself in passion. Ideas have become untrustworthy, and the sacrifices made for them are disconcerting. On the other hand, images can be recognized more sharply. No wishful thinking distracts anyone. If, say, the Condor played out a life that vacillated between enlightened despotism and tyranny, he would be opening his eyes upon distant pasts. I should, Vigo told me, scrutinize this closely as an experiment and shift the accent. In standing behind the bar, I would be nearer to reality than one who, precisely by taking it seriously, merely simulates it. I was able to follow my master that far, and so I took the job with that goal in mind. I am not saying that this was my only reason, for such decisions are complex. In addition, there was what is known as the emoluments, a lot of free time for my own work, the luminar, a good salary, the phonophore with the silver stripe, the ruler's aura. I soon noticed that the historical view did not suffice. As an ahistorical person, one becomes freer, but the powers one served in bondage are incalculably transformed. At certain midnights when I am working at the parvulo, the mood gets eerie. People thrash out topics that Vigo did not care to know about, much less enter into, just as I tried not to for the longest time. If the masters fall silent, the room seems more heavily charged than when they half-whisper words that they are evidently reluctant to pronounce, even if they are among themselves. At such moments the domo waves his hand. I have to heighten the ambience and lower the resonance. The subject, no doubt, is the forest. It must contain trophies and perils that recall the voyage of the Argonauts, rather than the heydays of historical and even prehistorical hunting. When I began my job, my janitor behaved like a true liberal. On the one hand, he was embarrassed by my working as a waiter. On the other hand, he felt politically strengthened in his security. For Cadmo, that is my brother's name, I am simply the ruler's menial. The old man is a speechifier, the boy a permanent anarchist, albeit only so long as things do not get hot. Degrees of freedom in which one can commit or omit everything are alien to both men. I stay with them when I come from the Kasbah. Our mealtime conversations are unpleasant. They can steer clear of neither the political nor the social. I prefer being out in Vigo's garden. I also have a pied-à-terre in the city, the attic of an old seaside house that used to be part of the bastion. From here I could throw out a fishing line, but the fish that indolently move their fins down there batten on the sewage of the Subura and are not sought after. Sometimes a gull rests on the windowsill. On the ground floor, a wine dealer runs a roadside shop, a salumeria that carries snacks. A bare garret. The walls, internal and external, are crumbling and encrusted with sea salt. I go there in order to meditate and gaze at the ocean, all the way to the islands and beyond, especially at sunset. A table, an armchair, a mattress lying on the floor, a wash basin on a rack, beneath it the water pitcher, plus a chamber pot that I empty through the window since, especially after drinking, I am tired of climbing up and down the stairs. No pictures or books on the walls. Instead, a mirror over the basin as a concession to Ingrid, whom I bring here after we have worked at the library or visited Vigo outside the walls. She remains barely an hour. This is a sort of obligation, a debt of gratitude to the mentor. Thus, I show up at home only for meals and not so consistently at that. Even our professional discussions are unproductive, based as they are on irreconcilable standpoints. A meta-historian who has left the space of history conversing with people who fancy they are still rooted in it. This leads to temporal lags between our reflections. The two of them wallow in a cadaver that, so far as I am concerned, has long since petrified into a fossil. Occasionally things turn funny when they get worked up over values that are at best parodied in Eumeswil. To that extent, they are even to be taken seriously, as typical of the era. If I like referring to the old man as my genitor, this does not mean that I do not hold fathers in high esteem. On the contrary, except that mine does not fill the role, or at most as a ham actor pasting on a Santa Claus beard. A fisher, a day labourer, a longshoreman do a better job of it. It is curious that precisely these free spirits command respect within a hierarchy that was shattered by their grandfathers. My genitor was married twice. Here in Eumesville it is customary for a man on the ascent, say a party man, to simply take whatever he finds. Once he makes it, the first wife no longer suffices for him. She is neither young and beautiful nor presentable enough. He trades her in for a status symbol. Here, for example, in our melting pot, one recognizes this development partly in the shift toward a lighter complexion. The man who starts out on a higher level tends to behave differently. His chief concerns are career and outer circumstances. It is only when he is firmly in place midway through life that other wishes burgeon in him. Now Aphrodite demands a late sacrifice. He often stumbles terribly. Recently, a 3-star general was trapped by a notorious hooker. In the Kasbah, such things are taken humorously. I was on duty at the Parvulo when the Domo reported it to the Condor. The Condor laughed. Then he won't lack for brothers-in-law. As for the Domo, what used to be called blots on the escutcheon suit him just fine. He turns moralistic when necessary. The professors tend to take a female student, one of those who sit in the front row and are enthralled by intellectual demands. This can work out nicely. For my genitor, it was his secretary. He got divorced for her sake. His first wife still lives in the city. He fathered Cadmo with her. They parted on amicable terms. Now and then he visits her to refresh some memories. My mother died young, during my early school years. I regarded the loss as a second birth. An expulsion into a brighter, colder foreign land, this time consciously. The world was transformed by her death. The house became inhospitable, the garden bare. The flowers lost their hues, their fragrances. It turned out, not gradually but immediately, that they lacked the maternal hand. The bees no longer alighted on them, the butterflies stayed away. Flowers sense human attachment not less but more finely than animals, and they requite it with affection. In the house, in the garden, I sought out the nooks. I often huddled on a stairway leading to the attic, a dark oubliette. I was unable to weep. There was a choking that dosed up my throat. Pain is like the major illnesses. Once we recover, we are immune. We are vaccinated against the serpent's venom. Scar tissue does not feel the bite. A numbness has remained. At the same time, fear was reduced in me. I grasped my surroundings more sharply the more my involvement waned. I could gauge their dangers and their merits. Later, this was also beneficial to the historian. It must have been back then, as I huddled in the darkness without finding a way out, that I formed my conviction of the imperfect and peaceless nature of the world, a conviction that still haunts me. I remained a stranger in my father's house. The pain must have worn on for a year or longer. Then it began to cool off like lava, which develops a crust one can walk on. That was the scar tissue. I grasped the rules of the society that surrounded me. I began advancing at school. The teachers started noticing me. Then Khan my hours at the piano. My genitor felt more and more benevolent toward me. I could have gotten dose to him, but I actually felt embarrassed when he put his arm around my shoulders or acted more familiar than necessary. Nonetheless, I was a child of love, unlike my brother, with whom he harmonized more intellectually and who regarded himself as the legitimate heir and me as a kind of bastard. I am willing to admit that his opinion was based not only on jealousy. However, they had put the divorce through quickly so that I could arrive at a conventional time. Besides, people are not so pernickety in Eumeswil. My mother had been the world for me. She gradually became a person. In later years, when my genitor was attending a congress, I had an opportunity to delve into my background. A historian is inconceivable without archival tendencies, and he preserves certain things that other householders tend to destroy once a process is completed. Almost every death is followed by a burned offering. My genitor, too, would have done better to burn the correspondence he had exchanged with my mother during the critical quarter year. He evidently could not part with those letters, and so he stored them in the attic. There, rummaging through a jumble of papers, I fished them out, and, in the dimness, I buried myself in the first few months of my existence. That was how I found out the time at which it began, and also the place. The map room at the Institute of History. I know that room. Almost nobody ever goes there, and the maps offer a fine shelter for a casual seduction. Still and all, I would not have thought my old man capable of such impetuousness. There must be women who know instantaneously that a spark has flown. This cannot be explained physiologically. My mother was such a woman. She stated cryptically yet unmistakably that I had appeared, or at least made myself noticeable. This did not quite make sense to my old man. He tried, at first theoretically, to talk her out of having me during the third week, when I already had the form of a mulberry and was starting to differentiate subtly. I was no bigger than a grain of rice, yet I could already distinguish between right and left, and a heart stirred inside me like a hopping dot on a screen. When I could no longer be thought away, he tackled me physically. I do not wish to go into detail. In any case, while floating in the amniotic fluid, I was menaced with dangerous adventures, like Sinbad the sailor. He tried to get at me with poisons and sharp instruments, and also with the help of an accomplice on the medical faculty. But my mother stuck by me, and that was my good fortune. According to my brother's version, my birth was her way of getting her hands on the old man. That is quite possible, but it was merely the practical side of an elemental attachment. As a mother, she wanted to have me. As a person, she had the right to watch out for herself. On the whole, one must judge such a relationship in all its intricacy. That I am able to do so, I owe not only to Vigo, but also to Bruno, my philosophical mentor. I remember a course in which he lectured on the mythical aspects of time and space. According to him, the father represents time and the mother space. In cosmic terms, he the heavens and she the stars. In telluric terms, he water and she earth. He creates and destroys, she receives, conceives, and preserves. Time is astir with insatiable disquiet. Every moment snuffs out the previous one. The ancients depicted time as Cronus, who eats his own children. As a Titan, the father devours his engendered son. As a god, he sacrifices him. As a king, he squanders him in the wars that he instigates. Bios and myth, history and theology offer any number of examples. The dead return not to the father but to the mother. Bruno also went into the differences between cremation and burial. I do not know whether I have quoted him correctly. Thus, water strikes me as really peculiar to the mother. The Christians identify it with the spirit. These are questions of category which have unleashed interminable wars. Cyrillus regards water as the most important of the four elements and as the stuff of the great metamorphoses. The findings of space travel seem to confirm that ex negativo. People well versed in mythology know that the incredible vastness of the sea is only in its manifestation. In Eumeswil, where for generations now people have been thinking in purely quantitative terms, that notion is inconceivable. I read in the memoirs of a Russian pilgrim that the sip of water we hold out in a cupped hand to a man dying of thirst is greater than the 7 seas. The same holds for amniotic fluid. In many languages, the words for ocean and mother sound quite alike, mer and mir. 9. In any case, I am willing to acknowledge that my genitor in going after me was behaving naturally, and as an anarch I have to admit that he was protecting his rights. To be sure, this is based on reciprocity. Our city teems with sons who have escaped their fathers in a similar way. Usually this remains obscure. The Oedipal relationship is reduced to a malaise between individuals. The loss of esteem is inevitable, but people get along with one another. Moreover, I am troubled less by my background than by the respect that my old man demands on the basis of his paternity. He cites a credit that is not his due, the fact that fathers, rulers, professors once lived and deserved this name. Nowadays, that is nothing but a rumor. When he swaggers, I sometimes feel like reminding him of the map room and the tricks he harassed my mother with. She sheltered me from him in her cavern just as Rhea shielded her Zeus against the gluttonous Cronus. Naturally, I avoid making this chess move. I am aware here, too, of imperfection which torments me. There are truths that we must hush if we are to live together, but you cannot knock over the chessboard. I owe my restraint partly to Bruno, whose course also covers magical and even practical conduct. He said, "If the words are about to flee your lips, then reach toward the left side of your chest for your wallet. You will then save your joke. It will accrue to your capital. You will feel your heart." That is how I act with my dad. At such times, I am even overcome with benevolence. This is also my advice to Vigo when he wants to parry hateful criticism by giving tit for tat. The fact that I forgo having a father precisely because I do not recognize him as my genitor is an altogether different matter. I seek a man for whom I can feel respect. This is possible even in Eumeswil, albeit exceptional. One finds spiritual foster fathers. The bonds one forms with them are stronger than those of blood. Of course, such a statement must be handled with care, for a material substratum will always be present. In this respect, one owes one's father the link to an infinite network. In the act of procreation, he celebrates a mystery that is unknown even to him. His intrinsic nature might perish in it. Thus, we could be more closely related to an uncle or a distant forebear than to him. Genealogists and also biologists are familiar with such surprises. They often shatter their system. The genetic burden is endless. It reaches all the way into the inanimate world. It can bring forth creatures that died out long ago. This digression may indicate why I prefer adoption to natural kinship. The fatherhood becomes spiritual. We are chosen relatives and not natural ones. Thus, eros must also prevail in spiritual kinship. Adoption is a more sublime repetition of godfathering. We pick the godfather, the pater spiritualis, and he recognizes himself in us. He accepts us. That is a contact to which we owe life, albeit in a different and, I dare say, immortal manner. I do not wish to speak of the heart. This is not the right place. My birth and the surroundings in which I was put may explain why I felt this kinship with 3 academic teachers, 3 professors. If I had had a vocation for craft, art, religion, war, I would have had different models and different ones again had I opted for a criminal career. During the tuna fishing, I watched the rays and his fishermen performing the drudgery. Their obedience is simply the equipment of the trust that binds them to him. He is their leader. They have elected him. More fatherhood is to be felt here, even when he treats them severely, than when I sit with my old man who swims in stagnant waters. A philosopher is expected to have a system. In Bruno, you would seek one in vain, even though he is well grounded in the history of thinking. His course on the development of skepticism since Heraclitus runs for an entire year. He is precise, and that is the basis of his reputation. This course covers the practical part of his theory, the handiwork, so to speak. Anyone who attends it has spent his tuition wisely. He will be satisfied. Gifted students who have already become teachers themselves get a great deal out of it. The person who teaches us how to think makes us lords over men and facts. While there is more here than meets the eye, this need not concern them. It would actually confuse them. To be sure, the things he conceals are not without an impact on them too. They light up the rationality of his lectures. Authority is more powerful in silence than in words. This obtains both for the monarch, who may be illiterate, and for the teacher of a high intellectual rank. When I had the good fortune of becoming intimate with Bruno, certain things remained tacit in the background, even on the nights when we had drained a glass or two. He loves wine, which, rather than subduing him, always leaves him more and more aglow. Bruno is short, with broad shoulders and a full, slightly ruddy face. The bulge of his eyes lends them an intense shine. When he speaks, his face can take on a penetrating boldness. It then grows ruddier. His ironic passages are accompanied by a smile that is almost imperceptible, yet as charming as a compliment. His maxim was a taste sample like that of an exquisite wine, reserved for the connoisseur. Thus, I often saw him facing me with a light, free gesture, as if he were lifting the curtain on a wordless realm when the angel of silence entered. Concurrence then supplanted comprehension. Bruno, too, considers the situation in Eumeswil favorable. The historical substance is used up. Nothing is taken seriously now except for the gross pleasures and also the demands of everyday life. The body social resembles a pilgrim who, exhausted by his wanderings, settles down to rest. Now images can come in. These ideas also had a practical meaning for my work. Vigo had advised me as a historian I would obtain glimpses of historical models that kept recurring without their having to move me, much less inspire my enthusiasm. That is how one studies the style of coins that have been withdrawn from circulation. Although worthless as legal tender, they fascinate the amateur. Bruno rounded this out by adding an insight. A wall with its lime wash already flaking off would reveal idols that, albeit long forgotten, were slumbering in private graffiti of proto-nay prehistoric power. That would be the limit of scholarship. Thus, my attentiveness when I stand behind the bar goes in 3 temporal directions. First of all, I am devoted to the comfort of the condor and his guests. That is the present. Next, I follow their conversations, the development of their objectives, the interweaving of their political plots. All this may be topical for them. For me, in Vigo's terms, it constitutes a model that is more sharply defined in small states than in great empires. Florence was enough for a Machiavelli. I am certain that the Domo has studied him. A few of his maxims sound as if they were borrowed from Il Principe. After midnight, when they have been drinking, I grow more alert. Words, sentences are spoken that obviously refer to the forest. I join these splinters into a mosaic. Larger pieces, fragments are offered by Attila's memories. Having lived in the forest for a long time, he is lavish with anecdotes. They are hard to pigeonhole in terms of time and authenticity. They demand the mythologist's flair rather than the historian's. A forest hermit lives as if in a feverish dream. I track these conversations like a hound all the way into the mimicry, the gestures and the depths of the silences. Then there is a stirring in the thicket. Is it the wind, or is an unknown quarry about to emerge into the clearing? The desire to capture the moment in a note is overpowering. This is an instinct that lives in every historian. I have ways of doing it. My duties include keeping the mess log. Any beverages and collations passing from the galley through the bar have to be entered. The point here is not so much bookkeeping as security. Thus, no one notices when I pick up the pencil and make my accounts. To be sure, the Domo asks to see the log. He is interested in such things as the tastes and habits of the individual participants. He cannot possibly spot a secret writing in the text. I introduced a dot system, and I imperceptibly emphasize certain letters. My goal here is not so much to capture my impressions as to mark the focal points. Here I come back to the meaning of silence. I also have to control the ambience, and at those times when I sense there is something in the room, I indulge in certain liberties by charging those moments with significance. I finally succeeded in making do with the ductus alone. I scrutinize my handwriting like a mirror of time. I would have ignored a detail in this context if it did not point to Bruno's methods. The fact that penmanship communicates things from a simple household budget to intellectual realms is a commonplace, and every graphologist knows that it reveals an image of character to the knowledgeable observer. But Bruno went further. For him, handwriting is a mirror that traps and releases the moment when we engross ourselves in it. Why were the tablets of Mount Sinai taken along during the wanderings? Everyone knew the text by heart anyway. And yet the tablets expressed something more than and different from the commandments, the commanding power. That was why the high priest secretly perused them before the sacrifice and probably touched them as well. Bruno, I say this making all due allowances, advanced in that direction. The mirror played a large part in this. Primal image is image and mirror image. Apparently, he expected unwanted results from my nightly reconnoitering and also felt I had the proper sensibility. As for my notations, I owe to him the luminous pencil that contains several refills. If a conversation turns ardent, bringing the forest closer, a finger squeeze makes certain refills, meant for this purpose, spring out of the reserve, as if I were releasing the safety catch on a gun. I do not need to make any special entries. I simply continue the list of consumed beverages. It may be my imagination, yet what is imagination? But once I look at these written columns, the conversations seem closer than when I heard them. It is as if their background were opening. Words then have the power not only to communicate but also to evoke. In retrospect, I saw the faces freeze as if during a ritual sacrifice. It was eerie. What might conjure up this effect? One could readily speculate that this lead refill was inoculated with one of those substances that carry us beyond the limits of perception. They work even in the tiniest doses, unweighable like wind-wafted pollen. Bruno frequently experiments with them, but allows no adepts to watch. Once, when I walked in unannounced, I found him completely absent. Behind the glass mask, I saw a face whose gaze I could not endure. Apropos, he clearly does not recall that visit. At any rate, I do not regard him as a magician. His path includes a not indelicate magical phase. It is meant only as an approach, the way a course in logic introduces the study of philosophy. Problems of passage arise here. Magical law must be forgotten, for it will be deceptive once the cosmic chase begins. That is the reason why the gods ultimately depend on human help. I suspect that Bruno has nevertheless opted for the underworld. At New Year's, some firms in Eumeswil offer their customers modest promotional gifts, usually mechanical pencils. These are reminders of the firms and their achievements. I assume that Bruno brought back the mechanical pencil as a similar reminder from one of his visits in the catacombs. A mere toy. It is probably meant to indicate the level of technology that has been attained there and to inspire, if not fear, then respect. And is technology the right word? Meta-technology would no doubt be more fitting. It applies not to the perfecting of means, but to their sudden transformation into a different quality. When a runner reaches his top speed, running turns into flying. A sample was supplied by that sparkling script. Verbal communication no longer sufficed. Once, people got fed up with pure dynamics, and so technology declined in the larger areas. This was matched on the other side by its plutonian concentration in the hands of a small, now autonomous personnel. 10. I see them as my spiritual fathers. I owe to Vigo an unbiased view of history, a view that works only when we are no longer involved in the pros and cons. That is the historian's delight. He takes part in the squabbles as Zeus does in the battles of gods and men. From under the varnish with which they were dimmed by the Enlightenment, the images emerge in their glory. Bruno gave me glimpses of the backgrounds that belong neither to history nor to the natural realm. Indeed, they are independent of the human presence in the universe. He was able to snuff out the historical consciousness and its torment. Why is it that I cannot distinguish the two of them clearly enough despite their differences? Presumably because they do meet and unite somewhere, for example in me. Thus all disciplines, say a biologist's and a physicist's, meet where antitheses are transcended in the atoms. I do not choose this simile at random. Vigo is turned toward the gods and Bruno toward the titans, one toward the forest, the other toward the underworld. Vigo peers into the world as into a picture book. The objects are charged under his eyes and they pounce on him. One evening, when we were sitting in his garden on the edge of town, he pointed to an araucaria. "Martin, do you see anything special about it?" It was a beautiful specimen of this tree whose silhouette lends an austere touch to our coast, yet nothing about it struck me as unusual. Vigo provided the explanation. 7 years ago, its tip was broken. Perhaps a bird wanted to rest on it, or an insect nibbled on the bud. A blemish. I almost chopped the tree down. It is good that I refrained, for what happened? One of the side branches straightened up and formed a new tip, like a soldier presenting a bayonet. Several years later, no trace of the injury could be seen. What is your opinion? I would call it the restoration of appearance through shape. I see you have learned from me. You must bear in mind not only that this 90-degree turn repairs the morphological damage, but also that the anatomy is modified all the way into the discrete structure, into the scarring which the forester calls the wounded wood. You can also view this genealogically. When the whorl straightens up, an offshoot takes over the task and the supremacy. The forests contain our elementary models, the gardens our social models. He then examined my response. What is manifested here? Nothing but Paracelsus's inner physician. He straightens the creature up again even after a decapitation. In my opinion, the mere sight of this tree is salutary. I can listen to Vigo for hours, and also join him in hours of silence. The moon hung over the Kasbah. The tree stood out against the pale, nocturnal sky. Its slender twigs were studded with round cones like a series of musical notes with heads. Just as Vigo wants to lead us beyond history, Bruno wants to lead us beyond knowledge, the one beyond the will, the other beyond conception. This is treated by the Guild as either regressive or utopian. Both men are considered unserious. I like them both, although and precisely because I have often enough heard my genitor and my brother poke fun at them during meals. The unnavigated seas lie beyond the pillars of Hercules. Herodotus and Heraclitus are their publicans. They did not like hearing such maxims, which I brought back from Vigo's seminar. They do not find them sober enough. Yet idealism is far from my mind, even though I have made sacrifices to it. I, in turn, feel it does not suffice to grasp facts according to their weight, but not their eros. Matter is concentrated in eros. The world becomes exciting. For this path, both teachers were helpful to me. They gave me what my genitor was unable to give me, since his love and his law were inadequate. Although an anarch, I am not anti-authoritarian. Quite the opposite. I need authority, although I do not believe in it. My critical faculties are sharpened by the absence of the credibility that I ask for. As a historian, I know what can be offered. Why do people who leave nothing unchallenged still make demands of their own? They live off the fact that gods, fathers, and poets used to exist. The essence of words has been diluted into empty titles. In the animal kingdom, there are parasites that clandestinely hollow out a caterpillar. Eventually, a mere wasp emerges instead of a butterfly. And that is what those people do with their heritage, and with language in particular, as counterfeiters. That is why I prefer the Kasbah even from behind my counter. At universities, there are always groups of teachers and students who view the way of the world together and not without pleasure. The content varies, the mood remains the same. It recalls the mood of sectarians within cults, and it always involves error. That was Vigo speaking. And Bruno. This applies to every intellectual expenditure, but it is nothing to crow about, for where does it ultimately lead? People convince one another that the world is imperfect. Then they send out calls for help and flash beacons of hope. It makes no difference whether Hercules cleans out the Augean stables or a mailman his pigeon house, and the stars do not draw closer no matter what pedestal one gets up on. Similar things can be heard when the wind wafts from the desert, but there are also euphoric moods. 11. There will always be people who speak better than the rest. The auditorium greeted this statement with obos. There will even be people who speak well. The disquiet increased. They had not come willingly to this supplementary lecture series that the Domo had foisted on them. It was a required course given by Thofen, the grammarian. Like a number of other directives from the Domo, I was able to follow this one from its inception. Such insights are among the joys of my profession. I am curious by nature. This is indispensable for the historian. A man is a born historian, or else he is boring. Saint-Simon went to court not because he was a courtier, but because he was a born historian. His being an aristocrat helped to facilitate his task. Those are roles. Had he played the part of valet de chambre, then, perhaps better, even tinier fish would not have escaped him. More important than the grands entrees was his familiarity with the derrieres, the fact that he was on good terms with Blois and Manukau. Not only did the prince witness that dreadful scene in Mali one evening, when the monarch was beside himself because his favorite bastard had failed in battle, the prince had also heard the preceding conversation with the bath servant. This is no digression. I am speaking about my sideline, that of night steward in Eumeswil. In that capacity, I had mentally followed a conversation between the Condor and the Domo. They were talking about the judgment in a civil proceeding. The Domo had the court transcript brought from his office, and he read a few sentences aloud. "Are you satisfied with the decision? A question mark should be put here." He reread the passage, shaking his head. "No, an exclamation point. The fellow's botched up the imperative." He examined the signature. "And not even a stenographer, just a paralegal." The Domo, unlike the Condor, is no soldier of fortune. He is descended from one of the old families. It verges on the miraculous that such names outlive the chain of upheavals. They owe their endurance to aptitudes that have developed through the generations, becoming instinctive, especially the diplomatic talent. The Foreign Service offers a number of survival options. I do not wish to go into detail. At any rate, if anyone in the group that I serve can be thought to have historical substance, it is the Domo. Of course, this is something he probably tries to conceal rather than flaunt. His relationship to power can likewise be seen as both primitive and late. The former view is held by my genitor, the latter by Vigo, my teacher. Vigo sees further, and he therefore knows that these two possibilities are not mutually exclusive. He also has an apt image for this. According to him, the primitive element is the basic stock of the individual and his communities. It is his bedrock on which history is established and which is exposed once more when history withers away. Humus with its flora piles up on the rock and vanishes again. In whatever manner, it either dries up or is swept away by tempests. Then the bare tuff emerges. It contains prehistoric inliers. Say, the prince becomes a chieftain, the physician a shaman, the vote an acclamation. This implies that the Condor stands closer to the start of the process, the Domo closer to its end. The end is dominated by the elemental, the start by the rational mind. There are historical examples of this, say, in the king's relationship to the chancellor or the commander-in-chief's to the chief of staff. In short, wherever business is divided between character and intellect or between being and doing. My genitor strikes me to maintain Vigo's image as someone who delights in dried bouquets, in flowers from Rousseau's herbarium. I can even sympathize with this as an academic. On the Tribune, my old man's self-deception becomes a deception of the populace. On the other hand, my interest in the Domo's squabbles with the Tribunes is meta-historical. I am absorbed in the model, not the urgent issue. At the Luminar, I studied the particulars of Rousseau's visit with Hume, plus the misunderstandings that led to Hume's invitation. Jean-Jacques' life leads from disappointment to solitude. This is reflected in his successors down to the present day. It hints that something human was touched at the core. The great ideas spring up in the heart, says an old Frenchman. One could add, and are thwarted by the world. I consider it poor historical form to make fun of ancestral mistakes without respecting the eros that was linked to them. We are no less in bondage to the zeitgeist. Folly is handed down, we merely don a new cap. I therefore would not resent my genitor for merely believing in a fallacy. No one can help that. What disturbs me is not error, but triteness, the rehashing of bromides that once moved the world as grand utterances. Errors can shake the political world to its very core, yet they are like diseases. In a crisis, they can accomplish a great deal and even effect a cure, as hearts are tested in a fever. An acute illness, that is the waterfall with new energies. A chronic illness, sickliness, morass, such as Eumeswil. We are wasting away, of course, only for lack of ideas. Otherwise, infamy has been worthwhile. The lack of ideas, or, put more simply, of gods, causes an inexplicable moroseness, almost like a fog that the sun fails to penetrate. The world turns colorless, words lose substance, especially when they are to transcend sheer communication. I have to occupy myself with the Domo's political standpoint insofar as it is significant for my studies. Anything beyond that, say, affection, I must avoid, like any kind of whirlpool. This does not interfere with my pleasure in hearing him speak, nor do I lack the opportunity. If the Yellow Khan or other important guests are not being served, then the night bar is peaceful. Often only the condor is present with Attila and the domo, plus the minions on duty. I perch on a high stool behind the bar. It makes me look as if I were standing by in full dress. My close observation of the guests is part of my service. I anticipate their every wish. To this end, I have an obliging smile at my disposal. I test it in the mirror before going on duty. I have already mentioned that I make notes on whatever is consumed. The minions wait on the tables doing the actual serving. That is the raised blind from which L observe my game. If I say I like hearing the domo, then my primary reason is a negative one, namely that he lacks the grand utterances with which I got fed up once I learned how to think for myself. Still and all, I must admit that at first his diction had a sobering effect on me, accustomed as I was to a style that replaces arguments with claptrap. The initial sobering effect is due to the economy of his expression. Few adjectives, few relative clauses, more periods than commas. The howlers are absent. Evidently correctness carries more weight than beauty, and necessity more than morality. This is not the kind of language with which orators address an assembly in order to sound agreeable and obtain agreement. Rather, it is the kind of language aimed at preaching to the converted. Usually the wording reassures the condor in whatever he is wishing anyway. Thus, it is the language of a man who knows what he wants and who transfers this wanting to others. Dico, I speak. Dicto, I speak firmly. Dictate, the T concentrates. I soon got accustomed to his diction, as to an older school, say, in painting. A tree-lined riverbank was seen, as interpreted by the late 19th century of the Christian era. Light, movement in the foliage, an interplay of general, changing impressions that developed through detailed transitions since Rubens. I could decompose it nicely at the Luminar. Now comes another room, the Florentines, circa 1500, after the banishing of the Medici. The air grows dry and transparent, the trees motionless, unhazy, here the cypress, there the pine. This is matched by the faces, the laws, the politics. For a long time now, the army has been producing all those who boast that they can clear up the mess whenever things are mired in the mud. The situation then gets more dangerous, for them too. There was a transition during which they formulated ideas that were the spit and image of those of the tribunes. This is no longer necessary in Eumeswil. Incidentally, the domo does without cynical remarks. This can be attributed to his strength. However, it is well known that military men do not move things much further than anyone else. Changes seem to have been taking place here since antiquity, since Marius and Sulla. In each case, an advance payment of faith, of goodwill, or simply of vitality has been used up. The world spirit loves blank pages. Once they are written on, they drop away. I sidestep, as I have said, any affection, any personal sympathy. As an Anak, I have to steer clear of such feelings. Working somewhere is unavoidable. In this respect, I behave like a condottiere who makes his energy available at a given moment, but, in his heart of hearts, remains uncommitted. Furthermore, as here in the night bar, work is a part of my studies, the practical part. As a historian, I am convinced of the imperfection, nay, the vanity of any effort. I admit that the surfeit of a late era is involved here. The catalogue of possibilities seems exhausted. The great ideas have been eroded by repetition. You won't catch any fish with that bait. In this regard, I behave no differently within my framework than anyone else in Eumeswil. People no longer demonstrate publicly for ideas. Bread or wine would have to cost a lot more, or there would have to be a rumpus with the races. As a historian, I am skeptical. As an Anak, I am on my guard. This contributes to my well-being, even to my sense of humor. Thus, I keep my property together, albeit not for myself as the only one. My personal freedom is a perquisite. Beyond that, I stand ready for the great encounter, the eruption of the absolute into time. That is where history and science end. If the domo's language pleases me more than my genitor's, then this is relative. His language is more concrete, but compared with, say, Attila's, it seems defoliated. One views the embranchment, the bare boughs, which, however, I must add, indicate the roots. The latter are mirrored in the branches. There is a depth from which logic ascends into language. I don't mean the logic taught here in Eumeswil, but the kind that establishes the universe and that, by rising into the ramifications of the universe, constantly keeps reorienting it. He who cannot speak should not judge. I have often heard that maxim from the Domo, so I was not surprised that he was irked by the crude blunders in that court decision. The immediate consequence was Thofern's required course, which he imposed on the law students. The professor is regarded as our best grammarian. 12. After incurring displeasure in the auditorium by giving his introductory lecture on qualitative linguistic distinctions, Thofern resorted to a diversion which garnered mirth and applause. Last night, when I was sitting in the Blue Egg with nothing wicked in mind. It must be noted here that Eumeswil has no shortage of low dives. There is something to tickle even the most devious fancy. That is the fruit of the Domo's liberality, which is supported by the Condor. To each his own, this motto is interpreted broadly here. The Domo said, "Whatever a man does in bed or even in a stable is his own business. We do not interfere. Bien manger, bien boire, bien foutre. By giving our blessing to all that, we relieve the police and the courts of an enormous workload. This way, aside from lunatics and gross criminals, we only have to deal with do-gooders, who are more dangerous. Our people in Eumeswil do not want a better life in some vague future. They want a good life right now. They do not want to hear a coin clink. They would like to have it in their pocket. They prefer a bird in the hand to a bird in the bush. We can even give them the chicken in the pot. The Domo banks on facts just as my janitor does on ideas. That is the difference between liberalism and liberality. As a historian, I must comment, everything is correct in its time. The Domo's methods presume the existence of our fella-like condition. The great ideas for which millions got themselves killed are worn out. Distinctions have largely vanished. Circumcised and uncircumcised, whites, yellows and blacks, rich and poor no longer take themselves so seriously in their qualities. At most, they take to the streets if there is a cash crisis or during Mardi Gras. All in all, a man can do or not do as he likes. Though a tyrant, the Condor, discreetly accompanied, moves like a common man in the marketplace and on the waterfront. He likes talking to people. "Karim, you old scoundrel, still up and about. I bet you're still at it, aren't you?" Such were his words to the rays of the tuna fisherman, a white-bearded man who is going on 80, and the oldster replied, "Condor, you mean during the week or at night?" The Blue Egg is a saloon frequented by criminals and flipped-out types. Vigilantes keep the Domo posted about anything occurring in the Bas Fonds. Theirs is a risky profession. Barely a month passes without the night watch stumbling on the corpse of a man who's been stabbed to death. So, needless to say, Thofern's mention of a place avoided by even the better sort of pimps was greeted with merriment. What he supposedly heard there did indeed involve a stabbing. The crooks were trying the case themselves. Having more to do by night than by day, they while away an occasional afternoon by sitting in on court trials. This is entertaining and also instructive for them. Here at the Blue Egg, they had been discussing a murder indictment that had fallen flat. The victim was an opium dealer. This traffic, though tolerated, is not without its risks. Indeed, tolerance is one of our watchwords. There are lots of things here that are prohibited yet seldom prosecuted, which leaves a semi-darkness on the outskirts of legality, consistent with the dreamlike mood of this tavern. In this twilight domain, the kickbacks are unlimited. People profit from this both in the Kasbah and in the underground. There are scandals, due less to poppy than to hemp. The former dazes, the latter rouses. A man runs amok through the streets brandishing a cold knife. A student burns to death in her bed. When the Domo thereupon summons one of the major dealers and appeals to his conscience, he need not add anything to stimulate the man's charity, nor do such donations leave any trace. The underworld likewise gets its tithe. The dealers, distributors and saloon keepers are especially vulnerable to extortion to which they resign themselves. They pay regularly and count it as overhead. This too leaves no trace. In the matter at hand, the dealer had risked a struggle for power that he could not handle. The affair had taken its nasty course. After sending him threatening letters, they had planted a grenade outside his door, then riddled a bodyguard with bullets, and finally sicked the rats on him. It was high time he left Eumeswil. He managed to reach a ship lying under sail in the harbour. He was, no doubt, planning to seek refuge with the Yellow Khan, relying overly on his protection. The rats are no laughing matter. Once they are set on the trail and have picked up the scent, their job turns into a greedy passion. As the dealer was mounting the gangway, a crate came loose from the hoisting crane, missing him by a gnat's eyelash. The crate was so heavy that it smashed through the gangplank. Unscathed, he reached his cabin, a camera di lusso with bath and salon. But when the facchino arrived with the baggage, he found the passenger lifeless in front of the vanity mirror. The ship's doctor, who was already on board, could only ascertain his demise. Heart attack. The excitement had obviously been too much for him, as it was for the horseman who galloped across a frozen Lake Constance without realizing it until he reached the other side. No seaman likes having a corpse on ship. There was still time to get rid of it. After filling out the death certificate, the physician returned with the porters to supervise the transport. The dead man lay bare-chested on the bed. That had been his position when the doctor had examined him. The doctor could therefore state under oath that the stiletto had not yet been thrust into the left part of the torso. Now its handle was sticking out. The stab had been dealt with professional self-assurance, and indeed in the brief span between examination and transport. No blood had flowed. The blade had bored through a dead heart. This was confirmed by the autopsy, which was also attended by Attila. I had therefore learned about the case from the conversations in the night bar. Policemen came aboard. There was a terribly annoying delay. Passengers and crew were interrogated, as indeed was everyone who had been present on deck or below. Attention focused on the facchino, who seemed to know more than he cared to admit, although he obviously had nothing to do with the crime. When threatened with having to testify, people prefer to conduct themselves like the temple monkeys of Nico, which cover up their eyes, ears, or mouth, and with good reason. But for the police, this is right down their alley. No matter how ensnarled a thread, once they get hold of one end, they unravel it all the way. It therefore did not take them long to get something out of the porter. He had noticed an irregularity. He confessed this all the more easily since the intruder had been a fachinaccio. These are the boys who sneak aboard vessels in the turmoil of departure, trying to wangle tips and watch out for opportunities. Working without a license, they are, needless to say, a thorn in the side of the facchini. This put the police hot on the trail. The phony porter, a hired killer, had done the stabbing. Like a shadow, he had slipped into the cabin where the dead dealer was lying in the penumbra just as the physician had left him. Then the intruder had carried out his task in a split second. That had been the topic of the conversation that Thofern had eavesdropped on at the Blue Egg, or claimed to have eavesdropped on, I was not sure which. I felt as if I had already read that embroiled plot in a novel, or seen it in one of the gangster movies that form the bulk of entertainment here, and are soon forgotten. The manhunt, with all its ins and outs, is one of those themes that never lose their charm and that go through infinite variations. At the Luminar, I occasionally view shortened versions from the Pitiful and by other authors. As for the murdering of a corpse, I found a similar recipe in Day Keane, a classic writer in this genre. It is one of the recurrent variants insofar as it touches on a nightmare that has been haunting us since the days of Cain. We believe we have murdered someone in a dream. Awakening restores our innocence. But why did the professor go into such detail? After all, he was teaching a course in philology, not law. However, Thofern showed he could live up to the domo's expectations. Gentlemen, the court had to decide on criminal charges for a capital offence. The defence moved for acquittal and won. Let us follow up on the defence by probing the verb to stab. If we assume that the dealer was still alive when the stroke was dealt and that it killed him, then that would have been a dear case of homicide with obvious intent to kill. Had the stroke not been deadly, then the defense attorney would have pleaded bodily injury, but neither was the case. A cadaver can be neither killed nor injured in this sense. Otherwise, the anatomist who dissects it would also have to be punished. Thus, The defense attorney had to prove that the dealer was not slain, but merely stabbed. That is, that the action that had taken place did not entail any criminal liability. The Facinaccio would have been incapable of such rationalizing because it went beyond his linguistic ken. The defense attorney had to feed it to him. Gentlemen, the difference between these two verbs, slay and stab, seems nugatory. But here you have an example of its scope by varying just two consonants. Thofern smiled. You can do a lot with that. A sound or two can make all the difference in the world. Anyone with a smattering of trigonometry can calculate the distance to the moon. He has estimated it. This is common property which he shares with the rest of society, but he alone can esteem it. The professor then came to a different issue. We might also suppose that the dealer fell victim to a gang and did not live to experience the final stroke. In such a case, this is not the continuation of an action, but a continued action. The distinction is not so much in the reproachability as in the punishability. The exact time of the deed must be pinpointed by the judge. If the tenses do not suffice, then precision must be achieved by paraphrase. He provided examples. Thofern was, no doubt, intent chiefly on presenting himself, which he succeeded at nicely. This opening lecture was meant to indicate a linguistics course that he offered as a puzzle of etymological detective work, exciting and, for me as a historian, even thrilling. He then examined the Facinaccio's intention, citing classical examples in order to differentiate various kinds of unlawful intent. For instance, had the dealer been only seemingly dead after the stabbing, and had the perpetrator, in order to dispose of the corpse, thrown it into the sea, thereby precipitating death by drowning, then the defense attorney would have been faced with a less simple task. Success would have come from a series of causal, yet not logically linked actions, which the ancient jurists would have classified under the heading of dolus generalis. Nowadays we get off more cheaply, for better or worse, because it has become more difficult to distinguish the real from the possible, and the latter, in turn, from the desirable. This involves a loss of verbal forms, which cannot be made up for by psychological speculations. I will deal with this subject when we get to the conditional tense. This was an idea that vividly haunted me too, albeit in a different way, since in Eumeswil we live in a city where nothing seems real anymore and anything seems possible. This levels distinctions and promotes a chiaroscuro in which day and dream blend into each other. Society is no longer taken so seriously. This adds a new touch to dictatorships. It is no accident that Vigo so frequently points to echoes of the 1001 Nights. A fisherman, a coolie or a dyer does not only fancy marvelous things in his dreams, he ascends from them like a grand seigneur. No barrier remains between wish and fulfillment. This recalls the possession of the magic ring. The cobbler who found it rubs it, and a demon spurts from the wall. I am the servant of the ring and its bearer. Master, order me to put up a palace overnight, wipe out a nation, or burn down a city. At least the fairy tale says so, and yet the nation is wiped out, and its far eastern city burns down to its very foundations. This was ordained by a textile merchant. The historians tried to comprehend it, but in vain. It was beyond their scope. Bruno is right when he classifies this as magic, which is developing into a scienza nuova, a subcategory of science. Technology has a subsoil. Now it is starting to feel queasy about itself. It is approaching the immediate realization of thoughts, as is achieved in dreams. Only a tiny step appears to be missing. This step could emerge from the dream itself, as if from a mirror. Eumeswil lends itself to this possibility. A door should no longer be touched. It should spring open on its own. Every desired place should be reached in the twinkling of an eye. Any world is drawn from the ether or, as at the Lumina, from the catacombs. That is the comfort side. Thofern derives comfort from conferto. I fortify, I strengthen, but comfort can become too strong. Starting with that introduction to the course for law students, I regularly attended Thofern's lectures and also his seminar. There I met few and nearly always the same people. Grammar is a dead science. That is why it is studied more seriously within the framework of the extinct languages than the current ones. However, the Domo wanted law students to master language as a logical instrument in order to be able to pass judgments. Nothing is further from his mind than aesthetic or even artistic sentiments, with the exception of music. Tyranny must value a sound administration of justice in private matters. This, in turn, increases its political authority. The latter rests on equality, to which tyranny sacrifices freedom. Tyranny is intent on overall leveling, which makes it akin to rule by the people. Both structures produce similar forms. They share a distaste for elites that nurture their own language and recognize themselves in it. Poets are even hated. As a grammarian, Thofen sets great store by the verb to nurture, and it is here that I, as a historian, concur with him. The historian's task is a tragic one. Ultimately, it has to do with death and eternity. Hence his burrowing in rubble, his circling around graves, his insatiable thirst for sources, his anxious listening to the heartbeat of time. What could lie hidden behind such disquiet? I have often wondered. How understandable the terror of the savage who, upon seeing the sun disappear, fears it will never return. The man who stored the mummy in the rock hoped for the mummy's return, and we rob it of its bindings in order to confirm his, no, our hope. When granting life to the past, we succeed in conquering time, and a subduing of death becomes apparent. Should the latter work out, then it is conceivable that a god will breathe new life into us. 13. The decay of language is not so much a disease as a symptom. The water of life is dwindling. Words have meaning still, but not sense. They are being replaced largely by numbers. Words are becoming incapable of producing poetry and ineffective in prayer. The crude enjoyments are supplanting the spiritual ones. That was what Thofen said. In the seminar he went into detail. People have always delighted more or less clandestinely in the Argods, the books sold under a coat or read with one hand. Then they are praised as models. The third tone dominates. By the third tone he meant the lowest level for naming things and activities. They are addressed in a lofty, a current, or a common manner. Each manner is good in its place. If the common becomes normal in colloquial speech or even in poetry, then it involves an assault on the lofty. Anyone who likes to gobble and boast about it forestalls any suspicion of viewing bread as a miracle that is celebrated in the supper. Profanation sets off lower forms of merriment. A head can ascend to a crown, a face to a countenance, or it can twist into a mug. Profanation can provoke merriment when it appears in pandemonium. The gods, too, laugh at Priapus. The merry Andrew has his place in the intermezzo, but if he rules the boards as a buffo assoluto, then the stage becomes a distorting mirror. At the Opera Comica, I always saw a few spectators departing once the laughter began to roar. This is more than a question of taste. There is such a thing as a collective gusto, also a jubilation, announcing imminent danger. The good spirits leave the house. In the Roman circus, the effigies of the gods were draped before blood flowed. Now and then, I, as a student of history, was permitted to help Thofen prepare his lectures. Thus, when dealing with the decay of language, he asked me to gather material about the contributions of the humanists. Those things go back quite a way, and it may be said that no one cares two hoots about them anymore. At the Luminar, however, the number of titles that I tallied up was enormous, even for the limited area of our city. As in any work on a scholarly apparatus, the main issue was to survey the cardinal points. Whatever has moved the zeitgeist cascades in a chaotic flood, one has to catch the historical meaning concealed behind opinions and events. The linguistic decay that the professor was talking about occurred during the final period of the wars between nations, a time that heralded great coalitions. First, the regional gods had to be disempowered worldwide. The fact that the Father was also affected indicated a planetary agitation. The disempowering of the Father endangers the heavens and the great forests. When Aphrodite bids farewell, the ocean goes dim. Once Ares is no longer in charge of wars, the shacks of flayers multiply. The sword becomes a slaughterer's knife. In a period of decline, when it was considered glorious to have helped destroy one's own nation, the roots of language were, not surprisingly, likewise pruned, above all in Eumeswil. Loss of history and decay of language are mutual determinants. The humanists championed both. They felt called upon to defoliate language on the one hand and to gain prestige for slang on the other hand. Thus, down below they robbed the populace of language and with it poetry on the pretext that they were facilitating speech, while on the heights they presented their mugs. The assault on evolved language and on grammar, on script and signs, is part of the simplification that has gone down in history as a cultural revolution. The first world state cast its shadow. Well, that lies behind us now. In this area, we have been released from wanting and wishing and can render unbiased judgment to the extent of our abilities. In Eumeswil, this applies, I feel, to Vigo, Bruno, and Thofern. Different as they are, these three are able to have a conversation without promptly serving up the trendy claptrap. One often has the impression in Eumeswil that it is not the person but the swarm that answers. Of course, there are raised platforms, as with my dear father, and also flounders of the deep, which unite in schools. Also common to all three teachers are their direct roots in mythology, which, unlike the psychologists, they have not sterilized and secularized. In this way, they can still test the very substance of the gods. By moving away from time, they approach the basic structures reiterated by events. Vigo describes the world state as one of the permanent utopias that the stewards of history more or less succeed in depicting. This is already inherent as a kind of hunger in natural history, say in the formation of macromolecules. Of course, these are also more threatened with decay. Perhaps they are even its portent. The further the state expands, the more it depends on equality. This occurs at the expense of substance. At the same time, Vigo sees the striving for maximum size and the inevitably following decadence as an overall pulsation. Even a jellyfish moves by unfolding and then closing its umbrella. Thus, in the course of history, the desire for largeness alternates with the desire for smallness. Boutefeu already knew, and we too have learned, that the world state both culminates and disintegrates overnight. The Leviathan's limits are not so much spatial as temporal. I have already mentioned Vigo's penchant for periods of decline. This has less to do with decadence than with the late maturity of highly advanced civilizations after the first frost. Hence, for him, Athens and Thebes are greater than Alexander's universal empire. All in all, he loves city-states. In the city-state, the landscape crystallized, while in the empire it is leached out, degraded to a province. Asia Minor was a wonderland before Alexander and still under the satraps. Herodotus and even Ovid provide us with some notion of that. Incidentally, for Vigo, Alexander rightfully carries the predicate of the Great. Perhaps this greatness would have been embodied more purely had it been limited to the human. He had more than historical power, he had divine might. That was why he was one of the last men to enter mythology. What about Christ? That was no longer a myth. For Vigo, the struggles of the Diadochi likewise demonstrated the uniqueness, the singularity of Alexander. They provided the model for the destiny of great empires. Vigo had then delved into Eumenes, the Greek among the Macedonians, our favorite Diadochus. Eumeswil is his namesake. Any further citing of him is fella-like arrogance. When the empire falls apart, as after Alexander's death, the old tribes try to isolate themselves again, each citing its own distinctive character. Yet this is precisely what they have lost by passing through the empire, like grain ground by a mill. All they retain is their names, akin to the Greek cities of the Roman era. Yet Alexandria blossoms. There, civilization resides no longer in the blood, but in the head. The period of the polyhistors, the lexicographers, the connoisseurs and collectors begins. The prices of antiquities and artworks skyrocket. Echoes still resonate in Eumeswil. They resemble the growing interest in the animal world during the very times that it begins to die out. That is how rooftops shine at sundown. That was more or less what Vigo said. I am quoting from memory, and roughly at that. As a historian, Vigo sees the course of the world as cyclical. Hence, both his skepticism and his optimism are limited. In any period, he would find a small spot warmed by the sun, even in Eumeswil. Bruno, in contrast, views the world as a magus. Now and again the earth shows its totem, that of the ancient serpent, by casting off or pulling in its limbs. This explains the world state, the atrophy of civilization, the dying out of animals, the monocultures, the wastelands, the increase in earthquakes and plutonian eruptions, the return of the Titans, say Atlas, who embodies the unity, Antaeus the strength, and Prometheus the cunning of the mother. The fall of the gods was tied to all that. They returned, they who had driven their father from his throne. That which had once been the diamond sickle that emasculated him was now reason and science. Bruno pointed out the underworldly character of technology, its feeding on ore and fire, the plutonian glare of its landscapes. The serpent regained its power. Those were birth pangs. In Eumeswil, people, as if on an island or on a shipwreck, lived off the cargo for how much longer? The gods were already mocked by schoolchildren, and why not? They would soon have new dolls, the supply is endless, and why gods? Surprises were in the offing. Bruno has access to the catacombs, and, in regard to knowledge of the real powers, resembles Vigo, less than he resembles Attila, who has lived in the forests. Bruno withdrew from the field of history more resolutely than Vigo. That is why I prefer the former's retrospect, but the latter's prospect. As an anarch, I am determined to go along with nothing, ultimately take nothing seriously, at least not nihilistically, but rather as a border guard in no man's land, who sharpens his eyes and ears between tides. I therefore cannot consider returning. This is the final refuge of the conservative who has lost all political and religious hope. To him, 1,000 years are now small change. He bets on the cosmic cycles. Someday, Paraclete will appear. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa will rise from his enchanted sleep and step forth from the mountain. But meanwhile, development still exists here, and so does time. Temporality returns, forcing even gods to do its drudgery. That is why there may be no eternal return. That is the paradox. There is no eternal return. Better, the return of the eternal. It can take place only once. Time is then captured. Thus, in Vigo's garden, I had come out of myself while the moon hung over the Kasbah. "Look," he said, "we have discovered a sore point." He said that to me, whose skin is nothing but sores. The idea of the eternal return is that of a fish that wants to jump out of the frying pan. It falls on the stoveplate. Above all, Thophan feels loss. His suffering is that of the artistic person in an unartistic time. He knows the values and also the criteria. His disappointment is all the more acute when he applies them to the present. I suspect that he was moved by a poetic instinct, but expression fails him. In a godless space he resembles the fish whose gills keep quivering after the surf has hurled it upon the reef. That which was pleasure in its element is turned into pain. The age of Pisces is past. For me as a historian, such torment is all too familiar. In our guild it has given rise to famous works. The mood of the wasteland is part of it. In a vacuum, structures advance in a surreal way, a stimulant, a foretaste of death that is the magic of the brass city. The man who opens the tombs with awe finds more than putrefaction, indeed more than the joys and sorrows of bygone eras. This is precisely why the historian suffers less than the poet, whom no knowledge avails, and to whom the deserted palaces no longer offer shelter. I would have liked to get closer to Thophan, as I had done with my two other teachers, but I soon realized that it was not possible. His fear of contact is extraordinary. He avoids even the sun. The law students have nicknamed him the Paleface. If, as a professorial duty, he has to receive a student, he avoids shaking hands, and he offers him a chair in the farthest corner. His hands are inflamed from frequent washing, which includes thorough brushings. It seems peculiar that he has risen to the rank of professor. History was his minor subject, and Vigo says that it took trickery to examine him. Offering Thophan a ride, he had engaged him in conversation, but when Thophan realized what was going on, he jumped out of the car, injuring himself. He passed all the same. Such anxieties spring from his almost skinless sensitivity, which, on the other hand, make him receptive to the finest shadings. It is a delight to participate in one of the exegeses in which he exposes the body of a poem, gingerly following its movement, feeling its pulse. He never explicates the euphony. He quotes it as if inviting the poet in. His delivery is both subdued and passionate, interrupted by pauses that reach deeper than words. Not even the law students can resist. He scans with his fingers, casually beats time with his arm. Whenever possible, he secures the manuscript or has it photocopied at the luminar. I noticed that, albeit holding the page in his hand, he nevertheless recites from memory. What he cares about is the poet's presence, a magical trait which delighted Bruno when I told him about it. On the other hand, Thophan's sensitivity to language brings him less joy than sorrow. Even in a casual conversation, breaches that no one else perceives disturb him as shirt-sleeved affronts. For all that, the self-assurance of his delivery is astonishing. He then speaks ex cathedra. In so doing, he resorts to irony, the classical weapon of the underdog. So much for my teachers, to whom I feel closer than to my genitor, for I prefer kinship of spirit to that of blood. It would, of course, be marvelous if the two overlapped. In the old days, that was known as one heart and one soul. Back then, soul was still synonymous with spirit. But even my brother is alien to me. As I have already said, I have nothing against authority, nor do I believe in it. Rather, I need authority, for I have a conception of greatness. That is why, although not without skepticism here too, I associate with the top rank. To be fair, I will not conceal that I also owe something to strata that might be called the humus of education. In teaching, there is an eros that is reserved for simple minds. Their knowledge is a patchwork, yet it is received and handed around like bread. Showing something to children, say a clock, and explaining how the hands work will delight them, as if they were raising a curtain or drawing a circle on a blank page. There is enchantment here.